Chapter 1. Journey to Sylvania. The cart jolted as the wheels hit a rut in the muddy road, jolting Hendrik Falk from his thoughts. He tightened his grip on the wooden seat and pulled his cloak tighter against the biting wind. Overhead, the gnarled branches of dying oak stretched like skeletal fingers, blotting out the pale sun. The air was colder than it should have been for early autumn, and the farther the cart carried him into Sylvania, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Hendrik glanced at the driver, an elderly man wrapped in layers of tattered wool. The man's face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his hands gripped the reins with white-knuckled fervor. He hadn't spoken since they'd crossed into the borders of Sylvania earlier that morning, save for muttered prayers Hendrik recognized as appeals to Sigmar. "Do you always pray this much, or does Sylvania bring it out in you?" Hendrik asked, forcing a smile in an attempt to lighten the mood. The driver flinched and gave Hendrik a quick, nervous glance. "You'll understand soon enough, scholar," he replied, his voice trembling. "We don't speak lightly of this place." Hendrik sighed and leaned back in his seat, adjusting the leather strap of the satchel slung across his chest. It was heavy with parchment, ink, and a handful of holy texts provided by the Church of Sigmar. While he appreciated the Church's concerns about heretical activity, he privately doubted the seriousness of the assignment. The reports were vague at best. A series of disappearances near the remote town of Wolfsbach, eerie lights in the forests at night, and rumors of unnatural creatures roaming the countryside. Peasant superstition, Hendrik muttered under his breath. The Church was far too eager to see corruption and heresy in every shadow, and Hendrik had seen enough of rural life to know that fear of the unknown often led to wild tales. Wolves and bandits, perhaps, or a particularly ambitious cult, though such groups rarely lasted long so close to Sigmar's influence. Still, he had his orders. The Archlector had been clear: investigate the disappearances, confirm or deny any heretical activity, and return with his findings. If there was corruption, Hendrik was to document it and, if necessary, petition for reinforcements. He was no witch hunter, nor was he trained to deal with the darker forces the Church so feared. His role was one of observation and record-keeping, not confrontation. The cart crested a low hill, and Hendrik caught his first glimpse of Wolfsbach. The town lay nestled in a shallow valley, surrounded by dense forests that stretched toward the jagged peaks of the World's Edge Mountains. From this distance, the village looked deserted. Smoke rose from only a handful of chimneys, and the crooked roofs of the houses seemed to lean inward, as though bowing under some unseen weight. The driver slowed the cart as they approached the outskirts of the village. A crude wooden sign marked the entrance, its paint faded and peeling. Wolfsbach, it read, though someone had scratched an X over the name and scrawled "Beware" beneath it in crude letters. "Not very welcoming," Hendrik remarked dryly. The driver brought the cart to a halt and turned to face him. "This is as far as I go," he said firmly. "I'll not set foot in Wolfsbach. The people here, they don't take kindly to outsiders, and if you sense you won't linger longer than you must." "I'll keep that in mind," Hendrik replied, climbing down from the cart. He adjusted his satchel and slung it across his shoulder. "Thank you for the ride." The driver gave him a curt nod and snapped the reins. The cart lurched forward, the wheels creaking as it rolled away down the road. Hendrik watched until the cart disappeared over the hill, leaving him alone at the edge of the village. The streets of Wolfsbach were eerily silent. Hendrik walked cautiously, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The houses were close together, their shutters closed tight, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. He passed a well in the center of the village square, its bucket tipped over, and the rope frayed as though it hadn't been used in weeks. A faded banner bearing the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar hung limply from a wooden post, its edges torn and stained. Hendrik approached the nearest house and knocked on the door. "Hello?" he called. "I'm Hendrik Falk, a scholar of the Church of Sigmar. I've been sent to investigate recent events in the area. May I speak with someone?" There was no answer. Hendrik waited a moment, then tried again. Still nothing. He moved to another house and repeated the process, but the result was the same. The village seemed abandoned, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows moved behind the shutters, and more than once he caught glimpses of faces peeking out before vanishing into darkness. Finally, an elderly woman emerged from a house near the edge of the square. She wore a patched shawl and clutched a wooden cane with gnarled hands. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, fixed on Hendrik with an intensity that made him pause. "You've no business here, scholar," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "Turn back while you still can." "I've been sent by the church," Hendrik replied, stepping closer. "I mean no harm. I'm here to help, if I can. What's happened here?" The woman's lips tightened. "The woods are cursed," she said after a long pause. "People go missing. Some come back, but they ain't the same." "Not the same?" Hendrik pressed. "What do you mean?" The woman's grip on her cane tightened. Eyes too bright. Skin too pale. They don't eat, don't sleep. And then, one night, they're gone again, dragged back to that cursed place. She pointed with a trembling hand toward the forest, where the dark silhouette of Castle Orlach loomed against the horizon. "The Baron knows, but he does nothing." Hendrik frowned. "The Baron?" "Nyklas von Carstein," the woman spat. "Our lord, or so he claims. He watches from that ruin of a castle while his lands rot. Mark my words, scholar, you'll find no help here. Only death." Before Hendrik could respond, the woman turned and shuffled back into her house, slamming the door behind her. He stood in the square for a moment, staring toward the distant castle. "This might not be so routine after all," he muttered. Hendrik squared his shoulders and began walking toward the road that led to Castle Orlach. Chapter 2. Arrival in Wolfsbach. The village of Wolfsbach appeared long before Hendrik reached its heart. Crooked rooftops poked through the mist, their shingles worn and moss-covered. Smoke trailed faintly from a few chimneys, though the air remained uncomfortably cold. Fields that might once have been lush now stretched out barren, littered with dead stalks of corn and grass yellow to the root. Hendrik tightened his cloak as the road dipped into the heart of the village. It was not his first time in such a place. Rural villages clinging to the borders of the empire often felt isolated, abandoned even, especially as winter approached. But Wolfsbach's silence was different, unnerving. Not a single villager greeted him on his approach. Doors were shut tight, windows shuttered and latched, and even the air seemed heavy with tension. He paused at the edge of the village square, surveying his surroundings. A dry fountain sat in the center, its once proud sculpture of Sigmar tarnished and chipped. Around it, houses leaned against one another, as if for support, their timbers sagging with age and neglect. An old inn stood at the far end of the square, its sign swinging on rusted chains. The image of a wolf, barely visible beneath the peeling paint, hinted at the building's name, the Howling Hound. Hendrik drew a deep breath and strode into the square, the sound of his boots against the cobblestones echoing far louder than it should have. At the inn's door, he raised a gloved hand and knocked twice. The sound reverberated, but no one answered. He knocked again, harder this time. After a pause, the door creaked open a few inches, and a man's face appeared in the crack. His eyes were bloodshot, and deep lines etched his face, but his expression was unmistakable fear. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. "My name is Hendrik Falk," Hendrik said, holding out his hand as if in greeting. "I'm here on behalf of the Church of Sigmar to investigate recent reports from this region." The man did not take Hendrik's hand. His eyes darted nervously around the square before landing on the scholar's satchel. "Church, is it?" he muttered. "You'll not find much faith left here, stranger." "Perhaps not," Hendrik replied, lowering his hand, "but I've been sent to help, and I'd like to ask some questions." The man hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly." The interior of the Howling Hound was as decrepit as the village itself. A fire burned weakly in the hearth, barely enough to push back the chill. The inn's common room was nearly empty, save for two older men sitting at a corner table, nursing mugs of what looked like stale ale. Their eyes flicked toward Hendrik as he entered, then immediately back to their drinks. The innkeeper, Hendrik assumed he was the innkeeper, led him to a table near the fire. He pulled out a chair with a creak of wood and gestured for Hendrik to sit. "Name's Otto," the man said, taking the chair opposite him. "I run the inn. or what's left of it. Hendrik nodded. Thank you for speaking with me, Otto. The church received troubling reports of disappearances in this region. Villagers gone missing, livestock killed, strange lights in the forest. Otto's face darkened. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Aye, people have gone missing. But it's worse than that. He hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he ran it through his graying hair. Some come back. Hendrik frowned. Come back? Surely that's a good thing. No, Otto said sharply, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not. They're not the same when they come back. They're pale. Quiet. Their eyes, there's something wrong with them. They don't stay long before they disappear again, and not a soul knows where. Hendrik leaned back, his mind turning over the possibilities. Disease, perhaps, or some kind of poison. Sylvania was known for its cursed soil and strange maladies. And what do the villagers think is causing this? Hendrik asked. Otto's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced toward the other men in the room, then back at Hendrik. Most blame the Baron. Hendrik tilted his head. The Baron? Nyklas von Carstein, Otto muttered, as though saying the name aloud might summon the man himself. He's the lord of these lands, though we never see him. Stays locked up in Castle Orlok, watching over us like a shadow. They say he knows everything that happens here. Do you think he's involved? Hendrik pressed. Otto didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and fetched a bottle of liquor from behind the bar. He poured himself a glass and downed it in one gulp before answering. I think it doesn't matter what I think, he said grimly. The Baron's been here longer than I've been alive. Maybe longer than any of us. And nothing happens in Wolfsbach without his knowledge. As Hendrik left the inn, his thoughts were heavy. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the square. The villagers who had dared to leave their homes during daylight were now scurrying back inside, bolting their doors and drawing curtains, as though preparing for siege. Hendrik watched them for a moment before setting off toward the church at the far end of the square. The small chapel of Sigmar was in no better shape than the rest of the village. Its steeple was leaning precariously, and the once proud twin-tailed comet above the door was tarnished and pitted. Inside, the air was musty, and only a single candle burned on the altar. A young priest was kneeling there, his back to Hendrik. "Excuse me," Hendrik said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. The priest startled and turned quickly. He was younger than Hendrik had expected, perhaps no more than 20. His robes were clean but patched in several places, and his face bore the same haunted look as Otto's. "Are you from the church?" the priest asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I am," Hendrik said. "My name is Hendrik Falk. I've been sent to investigate the troubles in this village. Are you the only priest here?" "Yes," the young man replied. "I'm Father Gustav. I came here 6 months ago, but—" He glanced nervously around the chapel. "I don't think Sigmar hears our prayers in this place." "Sigmar hears all prayers," Hendrik said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Tell me, Father, do you know anything about these disappearances?" Father Gustav nodded slowly. "The villagers believe it is the Baron's doing. They say he's cursed, that his family has been cursed for generations." "And you?" Hendrik asked. The priest hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know, but I feel it too. The darkness here, it's alive." As Hendrik left the chapel, the first stars were appearing in the sky. In the distance, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, loomed Castle Orlok. Its towers rose like jagged teeth, and its windows glowed faintly with an eerie, flickering light. Hendrik frowned, clutching the strap of his satchel. He had come to Wolfsbach expecting to uncover exaggerations and simple explanations. But now, standing alone in the silent village with the shadow of the castle looming over him, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. Something was very wrong here. Chapter 3. Signs of Trouble. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the ground as Hendrik set out from Wolfsbach, the damp air chilling him to the bone. The dirt paths leading out of the village were flanked by tangled thickets of brambles and skeletal trees. He had barely slept the night before, his mind haunted by whispers of curses and pale figures returning from the forest. Now, with his boots sinking into the damp earth and the smell of decay hanging in the air, he resolved to uncover the truth. The empty homestead. Hendrik's first stop was a small farmstead on the outskirts of the village, where locals claimed an entire family had vanished 2 weeks ago. As he approached, the field stretched out before him, barren and overgrown. What crops remained were shriveled and blackened, and crows circled lazily overhead, their calls breaking the eerie silence. The farmhouse itself was little more than a ramshackle structure leaning heavily to one side. Its door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Hendrik hesitated on the threshold before pushing it open fully, the sound of rusty hinges echoing like a scream in the stillness. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of rot. Dust coated every surface, and the table in the center of the room was set for a meal that had clearly never been eaten. Plates of food had molded into unrecognizable lumps, and a knife rested where it had been abandoned mid-slice. Hendrik's eyes flicked to the floor, where a set of muddy footprints led from the table to the door. They were smaller than his own, likely from a child. He followed the trail into the back room, where the footprints ended abruptly. The walls bore deep scratches, as though someone or something had clawed at the wooden boards. Splinters littered the floor, and in one corner, he found a crude doll made of straw, its face painted with a crooked smile. "Gone without a trace," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The drained herd. Hendrik continued his investigation, heading toward a nearby pasture where the innkeeper, Otto, had mentioned something unusual. The sun was rising higher now, though its weak rays did little to warm the air or brighten the shadowy landscape. He arrived at the pasture to find several sheep carcasses scattered across the grass. Their bodies were untouched by scavengers, as though even the crows and wolves avoided them. Hendrik knelt beside one of the carcasses, careful to keep his gloves between himself and the lifeless creature. A quick examination confirmed Otto's claims. The sheep had not been torn apart as he would expect from a wolf attack. Instead, each animal bore a single puncture wound on its neck, its body drained of blood. The surrounding grass was undisturbed, as if the attack had happened in total silence. "This isn't the work of a predator," Hendrik murmured to himself. He glanced around, his eyes searching the nearby treeline for movement. "And it's not natural." The trees stood still, their branches reaching like skeletal arms toward the overcast sky. Yet Hendrik couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He rose to his feet, brushing off his cloak, and made his way back toward the village. Claw marks and fear. The next stop on Hendrik's route was a small cluster of cottages at the edge of Wolfsbach. These homes were occupied, though the windows were shuttered and the doors bolted tightly. Hendrik knocked on the first door and waited, but no one answered. He tried another, and this time, after a long pause, the door creaked open just enough for a face to appear in the gap. An older man, stooped and gaunt, peered at Hendrik with bloodshot eyes. "What do you want?" he growled. "I'm here to investigate the strange happenings in this area," Hendrik replied evenly. "I'd like to ask a few questions." The man muttered something under his breath and glanced nervously over his shoulder before stepping aside to let Hendrik in. The cottage was dark, lit only by the weak light of a dying hearth. The air smelled of damp wood and stale sweat. "What do you know about the disappearances?" Hendrik asked once they were seated. The man crossed his arms, his hands trembling slightly. "People vanish," he said flatly. "Sometimes they come back, but they're not the same. Pale as the moon, their eyes gleaming like stars. It's like they're already dead." "And the livestock?" "Drained," the man said, shaking his head. "Wolves don't do that. But this ain't wolves." "Have you seen anything?" Hendrik pressed. The man hesitated, his face tightening as though he was weighing his words. Finally, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Count knows all." Hendrik frowned. "The Count? Baron Nyklas von Carstein?" "Aye," the man muttered. "His shadow's over this place. He's been here longer than anyone remembers, and he'll be here long after we're gone." "What do you mean?" Hendrik asked, leaning forward. "Are you saying the Count is responsible?" The man recoiled, shaking his head violently. "I didn't say that," he hissed. "I didn't say anything. You'll do well to keep his name out of your mouth, scholar. He sees everything." Hendrik opened his mouth to ask another question, but the man abruptly stood and opened the door. "That's all I'll say. Now go." An uneasy realization. By the time Hendrik returned to the village square, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the cobblestones. His mind churned with the day's discoveries, the abandoned farmstead, the drained livestock, the claw marks in the cottages. Each piece of evidence pointed towards something far worse than he had anticipated. The villagers' fear of Baron Nyklas von Carstein gnawed at the back of Hendrik's thoughts. He had dismissed their superstition at first, but the more he learned, the harder it became to ignore. Was the Count truly watching over Wolfsbach? And if so, why did the villagers speak of him with such dread? Hendrik glanced toward the forest, where the dark silhouette of Castle Orlach loomed on the horizon. The fortress seemed impossibly far and impossibly close all at once, its jagged spires like teeth against the darkening sky. For the first time, Hendrik felt a pang of doubt. He had come to Wolfsbach, expecting to find exaggerations, hysteria, or perhaps a mundane explanation for the disappearances. But now, standing alone in the gathering dusk, he wasn't so sure. "There's something here," he muttered to himself, clutching the strap of his satchel. "Something unnatural." And as the last light of day faded, Hendrik resolved to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. Chapter 4. A Summons to Castle Orlach. The letter arrived just after dawn, delivered by a pale, silent servant wrapped in a cloak so black it seemed to swallow the light. Hendrik was seated in the dimly lit common room of the Howling Hound, sipping a weak tea that did little to stave off the lingering chill in his bones. The servant had said nothing, merely placed the sealed parchment on the table before retreating into the shadows as quietly as he had come. Hendrik picked up the envelope, its surface cold to the touch. The seal was an intricate design, a wolf's head encircled by a thorned vine. Beneath it, the signature of Baron Nyklas von Carstein was pressed into the dark red wax. "A formal invitation," Hendrik murmured, running his fingers over the seal. The villagers had spoken the Baron's name with a fear that bordered on reverence. Yet here was an invitation, addressed to him personally, penned in an elegant, steady hand. Curious. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, its ink black and precise. "To the esteemed Hendrik Falk, scholar and envoy of the Church of Sigmar. It has come to my attention that you are investigating recent events within my domain. As the lord of this land, I welcome you to discuss these matters at Castle Orlach. It is my duty, after all, to ensure the safety and well-being of my people, and I would be remiss if I did not provide you with every assistance. A carriage will arrive at dusk to escort you to the castle. I trust you will accept my hospitality. Yours faithfully, Baron Nyklas von Carstein." Hendrik set the letter down, his mind already at work. The Baron's invitation could not have come at a better time. If Nyklas truly knew as much as the villagers claimed, he might hold the key to the strange disappearances. Hendrik doubted the Baron's motivations were entirely altruistic. Aristocrats rarely involved themselves in village affairs, unless their own interests were at stake. But the opportunity to meet the man directly was too valuable to pass up. "Are you truly going to accept?" Otto's voice cut through Hendrik's thoughts. The innkeeper was standing at the bar, polishing a chipped mug with a cloth that looked as tired as he did. "Why wouldn't I?" Hendrik replied. "The Baron may have information that could shed light on what's happening here." Otto set the mug down with a sharp clink. "You don't understand, scholar. The Baron, he's not like us. He sees things, knows things he shouldn't. If you go to that castle, you might not come back." "I appreciate your concern," Hendrik said, standing and tucking the letter into his satchel. "But I've come here to find answers. I can't turn away now." Otto shook his head, muttering something under his breath. "If you won't listen, then at least take this." He reached under the bar and produced a small pouch, its contents clinking softly. When Hendrik opened it, he found a handful of silver coins. "Keep these close. They say silver wards off bad things. Superstition, Hendrik said with a faint smile, though he slipped the pouch into his cloak pocket all the same. Thank you. The carriage at dusk. True to the Baron's word, the carriage arrived as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the mountains. Its black, lacquered frame gleamed even in the fading light, and its wheels moved soundlessly over the cobblestones of the village square. The driver, a gaunt figure dressed in a long, tattered coat, gave Hendrik a single, curt nod as he opened the door. The interior was as luxurious as it was oppressive. Rich, dark velvet lined the seats, and a faint, cloying scent of incense hung in the air. Hendrik settled into the seat, his satchel close at hand, as the door shut with a heavy thud. Without a word, the driver urged the horses forward, and the carriage began its ascent toward Castle Orlach. The journey was long and winding, the road cutting through dense, brooding forests that seemed alive with shadow. Hendrik watched as the trees gave way to rocky cliffs, the landscape growing more barren and hostile the closer they drew to the castle. The moon, full and pale, rose high above the peaks, casting its cold light over the jagged spires of Castle Orlach as they came into view. The castle loomed like a sentinel of death, its towers rising against the night sky in sharp, angular defiance. The walls were cracked and weathered, yet the structure exuded a sense of grim permanence, as though it had been carved from the very bones of the mountain itself. Meeting the Baron. The carriage came to a halt in the castle courtyard, where torches burned low in iron sconces, casting flickering shadows across the stone. Hendrik stepped out, the chill air biting at his skin, and looked up at the massive, iron-bound doors. They creaked open, as if anticipating his arrival. Inside, the castle was a stark contrast to its exterior. The grand hall was richly adorned with faded tapestries, intricate carvings, and an array of ancient artifacts displayed in glass cases. A long table dominated the room, its surface polished to a mirror sheen and set with goblets and plates of silver. "Ah, Master Falk." The voice was smooth and deep, cutting through the silence like a blade. Hendrik turned to see a tall figure descending the grand staircase, his steps as silent as a shadow. Baron Nyklas von Carstein was as the villagers had described, pale and striking, his dark hair swept back to reveal sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes. His black coat was finely tailored, and his movements were deliberate, almost predatory. "You honor me with your presence," Nyklas said, spreading his arms in welcome. "I trust your journey was not too arduous." "It was enlightening," Hendrik replied, inclining his head. "I appreciate your invitation, Baron." "Come," Nyklas said, gesturing toward the table. "We have much to discuss." As Hendrik followed the Baron, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man's gaze lingered on him a moment too long. Nyklas's presence filled the room, not with warmth, but with an unsettling energy that set Hendrik's nerves on edge. He told himself it was simply the atmosphere of the castle, a place so steeped in history and mystery that it was bound to unnerve even the most rational mind. But as he took his seat across from the Baron, the flickering light of the torches casting strange shadows across the walls, Hendrik felt the first tendrils of doubt. This was no ordinary nobleman, and Castle Orlach was no ordinary place. Chapter 5. The Count of Castle Orlach. The Baron's study was an elaborate space, a curious mixture of refinement and decay. Rows of ancient tomes filled the towering shelves, their spines cracked with age, while a large, intricately carved desk dominated the room. The air was thick with the faint scent of old parchment and candle wax. The room's sole window, a narrow slit of stained glass, painted fractured colors on the stone floor, though no warmth penetrated its chill. Baron Nyklas von Carstein moved with quiet precision, gesturing for Hendrik to sit in a high-backed chair near the hearth. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the Baron's pale features. Despite the warmth of the room, Nyklas wore no cloak, his finely tailored coat fitting him like a second skin. "You must forgive the austere nature of my home," Nyklas began, his voice smooth and calm. "Castle Orlach has seen better days, as has Sylvania." Hendrik studied the man as he sat. Nyklas was strikingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to drink in every detail of the room. His skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, but his demeanor radiated an unsettling charm. Hendrik forced himself to focus, reminding himself that this was a man of authority and potential knowledge, not a subject for idle speculation. "Your hospitality is appreciated," Hendrik replied, setting his satchel beside his chair. "Though I confess I did not expect to receive an invitation from you so soon after my arrival in Wolfsbach." "News travels quickly in Sylvania," Nyklas said with a faint smile. "I make it my duty to stay informed, particularly when strangers arrive in my domain." Hendrik hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "Then you may already know why I am here." "I understand you are investigating disappearances," Nyklas said, folding his hands on his lap. "An unfortunate reality in these lands. The forests are unforgiving, and the roads, well, they can be perilous. Bandits, wild animals. The occasional overzealous tale of something more sinister." "Overzealous?" Hendrik echoed. "You don't believe the villagers' claims, then?" Nyklas chuckled softly, the sound low and measured. "The people of Wolfsbach are prone to superstition, Master Falk. They see shadows and imagine demons. It is an unfortunate side effect of living so close to the heart of Sylvania." Hendrik shifted in his chair, his fingers brushing the edge of his satchel. "And yet, their fear seems genuine. They speak of people returning from the woods, pale and changed." Nyklas's expression did not falter, though his eyes glinted briefly in the firelight. "Such stories are common here. The forests have a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially at night. Those who wander too far often return shaken, or not at all." "And the livestock, drained of blood," Hendrik pressed. "Surely that is not the work of shadows." "Wolves," Nyklas replied smoothly. "Large and cunning, but wolves nonetheless. It is unfortunate, but not uncommon." Hendrik frowned. Nyklas's answers were carefully constructed, offering plausible explanations without ever fully addressing the villagers' fears. It was clear the Baron was a skilled conversationalist, adept at deflecting questions while maintaining an air of sincerity. "You seem skeptical," Nyklas said, leaning forward slightly. "I cannot blame you. Sylvania has a reputation, does it not?" "A well-earned one," Hendrik replied, "and one that has brought me here. My goal is not to indulge superstition, but to uncover the truth. If there is a mundane explanation, I will find it. But if there is something more—" "Something more?" Nyklas prompted, his smile faint but sharp. "What do you believe, Master Falk?" Hendrik hesitated, feeling the weight of the Baron's gaze. "I believe the Empire has seen its share of darkness, and that the Church of Sigmar must be vigilant. Sylvania may be remote, but it is still part of the Empire. Its people deserve protection, not abandonment." Nyklas's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "A noble sentiment. You are a man of conviction, Master Falk. I respect that." The room fell silent for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Hendrik shifted in his chair, uncomfortable under the Baron's unrelenting scrutiny. Finally, Nyklas rose from his seat, his movements as smooth and deliberate as ever. "You are welcome to stay at Castle Orlok for the duration of your investigation," Nyklas said, moving toward the window. "My resources are at your disposal, and my staff will ensure you are comfortable." Hendrik rose as well, though he made no move toward the Baron. "That is generous of you, my lord." "I am simply fulfilling my duty," Nyklas said, his tone calm. "Sylvania may be forgotten by the Empire, but I have not forgotten my people." There was something in the Baron's voice, an undercurrent of bitterness, perhaps, or a warning unspoken. Hendrik could not tell which. He inclined his head politely and retrieved his satchel. "If you will excuse me," he said, "I would like to review my notes and prepare for tomorrow." "Of course," Nyklas replied, turning back to face him. "My steward will escort you to your quarters. Should you require anything, do not hesitate to ask." Hendrik nodded, but as he left the study, he could feel the Baron's eyes on his back. There was something unnerving about the man, a sense of controlled power, carefully hidden beneath his polite exterior. The villagers' fear of Nyklas suddenly felt less like superstition and more like a warning. The castle's shadow. The steward led Hendrik through the winding halls of the castle, their footsteps echoing on the cold stone. Tapestries depicting battles and family crests lined the walls, their colors faded with age. Candles burned low in their sconces, casting flickering shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with each step. Hendrik's quarters were simple but well appointed. A large bed with heavy, velvet curtains dominated the room, and a small desk sat beneath a narrow window overlooking the forest. The steward lit a lantern and left without a word, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. Hendrik set his satchel on the desk and sat down heavily. He pulled out his journal and began scribbling notes, his mind racing. Nyklas's hospitality was welcome, but his demeanor left Hendrik uneasy. The Baron's answers had been too perfect, his manner too composed. And then there were the villagers' words, "The Count knows all." Hendrik leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the dark expanse of forest. Somewhere out there lay the answers he sought. And somewhere within the castle, he suspected, lay secrets the Baron was not eager to share. Chapter 6. The Banquet of Shadows. The Grand Hall of Castle Orlok was a cavernous space, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into the gloom. Rows of faded banners hung limply from the walls, each adorned with sigils and crests long forgotten by time. Chandeliers of wrought iron cast dim, flickering light, their candles fighting to push back the shadows. The air smelled faintly of wax, dust, and something metallic that Hendrik couldn't quite place. At the far end of the hall, a long table had been set with an elaborate feast. Platters of roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and glistening fruits were arrayed in decadent abundance. Goblets of deep red wine stood at each place setting, the liquid catching the candlelight like liquid rubies. Baron Nyklas von Carstein was already seated at the head of the table when Hendrik entered, his presence as commanding as ever. He rose with a gracious smile and gestured for Hendrik to take the seat to his right. "Master Falk," Nyklas said, his voice smooth and warm, "I trust your accommodations are to your liking." "They are, thank you," Hendrik replied, inclining his head. "You have been most generous, my lord." "I take pride in my hospitality," Nyklas said, motioning for Hendrik to sit. "Please, make yourself comfortable. Tonight's fare is among the finest Sylvania has to offer." The silent servants. As Hendrik took his seat, he noticed the servants standing against the walls, their expressions blank and their postures unnaturally rigid. Dressed in dark livery, they moved without a sound, their eyes downcast as they began to serve the meal. Plates were placed before Hendrik with eerie precision, each motion smooth and practiced. Yet their silence unsettled him. Not a whisper, not a cough, only the faint rustle of fabric as they moved. "Your staff is remarkably disciplined," Hendrik remarked, glancing toward one of the servants. Nyklas's smile widened ever so slightly. "They take their duties seriously. It is a rare quality these days, don't you think?" Hendrik nodded but said nothing more, turning his attention to the food. The meal looked exquisite, tender slices of roasted venison, seasoned with fragrant herbs, golden potatoes glistening with butter, and a selection of fruits that looked impossibly fresh for a land as barren as Sylvania. Yet, as Hendrik took his first bite, he noticed the flavors were muted, as though the food lacked something vital. Nyklas, meanwhile, barely touched his plate. He sipped occasionally from his goblet, his pale fingers wrapped delicately around its stem, but made no effort to eat. When Hendrik glanced toward the Baron's plate, he noticed it remained untouched, save for a single piece of bread that had been broken in half, but not consumed. "You're not eating, my lord," Hendrik said cautiously. Nyklas waved a hand dismissively. "I find my appetite wanes as I grow older. But please, do not let my habits spoil your enjoyment." Hendrik nodded again, though unease prickled at the back of his mind. He reached for his own goblet and took a sip of the wine. It was rich and dark, with an earthy undertone that lingered on his tongue. Yet there was something disconcerting about its depth, as if it hid secrets too old and dark to comprehend. Inconsistencies and omissions. As the meal continued, Hendrik's attention wandered to the room itself. The grand hall, for all its opulence, carried an air of neglect. The tapestries were frayed at the edges, and the once brilliant murals on the walls had faded into muted, indistinct shapes. Yet the most curious detail was the absence of mirrors. Not a single reflective surface adorned the hall, not on the walls, not on the ornate sideboards, and not in the decorative fixtures that flanked the hearth. "Your castle is fascinating," Hendrik said, choosing his words carefully. "The architecture suggests a history far older than most in the Empire." Nyklas inclined his head. "Castle Orlok is indeed ancient. It has stood for centuries, weathering the storms of war and time. My family has taken great care to preserve its legacy. And yet," Hendrik continued, gesturing toward the walls, "it seems some parts of its history have been forgotten." Nyklas's smile remained fixed, though his eyes glinted with something unreadable. "History has a way of erasing itself, Master Falk. Sometimes what is forgotten is best left that way." Hendrik felt a chill despite the fire burning in the hearth. He decided to steer the conversation back to his investigation. "I understand you've lived here for many years," he said. "Surely you've heard of the disappearances in the surrounding villages?" Nyklas leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I am aware of the rumors, yes. It is unfortunate. But Sylvania is a dangerous land. Wolves, bandits, sickness. There are many threats that can claim a life." "And the stories of people returning changed?" Hendrik pressed. The Baron's expression did not falter. "Superstition. The villagers are prone to seeing patterns where none exist. It is human nature, is it not?" Hendrik opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. Nyklas's answers were too smooth, too practiced. He could not decide whether the Baron was deliberately hiding something or simply indulging the scholar's curiosity with measured deflections. A chill in the air. By the time the meal ended, the hall seemed colder than before. The servants cleared the table with the same silent efficiency they had shown earlier, their faces impassive as they worked. Nyklas stood and gestured for Hendrik to follow him toward the hearth. "I trust you found the meal satisfactory," the Baron said, motioning for Hendrik to sit by the fire. "It was memorable," Hendrik replied carefully. "Good," Nyklas said, his gaze lingering on Hendrik for a moment too long. "I must say, Master Falk, your presence here is most intriguing. Few outsiders venture this deep into Sylvania, and fewer still return with their convictions intact." Hendrik frowned. "You speak as though the land itself is a threat." "In a way, it is," Nyklas said, his tone turning contemplative. "Sylvania is a place of shadows, Master Falk. It has always been so. Those who dwell here understand that to survive, one must embrace the darkness." "Embrace it?" Hendrik repeated, his unease growing. Nyklas smiled faintly. "Not all darkness is evil, just as not all light is pure. Perhaps you will come to see that in time." The cryptic remark hung in the air, and Hendrik found himself at a loss for a response. The Baron's words seemed to echo within him, stirring doubts he could not place. He realized with a start that his hands were trembling, though whether from the cold or something deeper, he could not say. "My lord," Hendrik said, rising to his feet, "if you'll excuse me, I think I shall retire for the night. It has been a long day." "Of course," Nyklas said, his expression unreadable. "Rest well, Master Falk. And should you need anything, do not hesitate to call upon me." As Hendrik left the hall, he could feel Nyklas's eyes on his back, watching him until he disappeared into the shadows of the castle. The air in the corridor was colder still, and the flickering candlelight seemed to distort the walls, casting shapes that danced just out of view. Something was deeply wrong in Castle Orlok, Hendrik realized, and whatever it was, the Baron was at its center. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Library. The castle was unnervingly quiet as Hendrik wandered its shadowy corridors. The heavy stone walls seemed to absorb sound, making even the slightest creak of the floorboards echo unnaturally. The lantern in his hand cast flickering light, sending shadows dancing across faded tapestries and cracked stone. Sleep had eluded him, and his mind was restless, filled with the cryptic words and unsettling charm of Baron Nyklas von Carstein. The exploration wasn't planned. Hendrik had intended only to stretch his legs and clear his thoughts, but something about the castle seemed to call to him. Its labyrinthine passages seemed designed to disorient, and before long Hendrik found himself in a wing he did not recognize. The air grew colder, and a faint, musky scent drifted from somewhere ahead. At the end of the corridor, a large wooden door stood slightly ajar. Intrigued, Hendrik approached, pushing the heavy door open with a creak. What lay beyond made him pause. The room was enormous, larger than the great hall, with high vaulted ceilings and shelves that climbed all the way to the shadowed rafters. It was a library, its sheer size and the number of books staggering. Hundreds, no thousands, of volumes lined the shelves, their spines worn with age. Some were bound in leather, others in materials Hendrik couldn't immediately identify. A spiral staircase wound upward, connecting multiple tiers of shelves. At the center of the room stood a massive oak table, its surface cluttered with open books, scattered scrolls, and writing implements. The faint smell of ink and aged parchment filled the air, mingling with a subtle undercurrent of something metallic, like old blood. The forbidden texts. Hendrik stepped inside, his lantern casting warm light over the shelves. He approached the nearest one and scanned the titles, many of which were in languages he didn't recognize. What little he could decipher sent a chill down his spine, references to necromancy, forbidden rites, and dark histories of the von Carstein line. He reached for a book bound in cracked black leather, its title embossed in faded gold. The Secrets of Transcendence, a treatise on the undead. Hendrik opened it carefully, his scholarly instincts overpowering his unease. The pages were brittle, their edges tinged with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The text was dense and filled with diagrams of skeletal constructs, descriptions of rituals, and fragmented theories on binding souls to mortal vessels. A phrase caught his eye, one that sent a shiver down his spine. The master of death bends eternity to his will. Hendrik set the book down, his hands trembling. This wasn't just an old family library or a collection of historical curiosities. These were tomes of forbidden knowledge, texts outlawed by the Church of Sigmar and punishable by death if found in possession. He moved to the table, his curiosity overcoming his fear. The open books displayed diagrams of human anatomy, but not for healing purposes. The illustrations detailed the manipulation of bodies, how to raise them, control them, and preserve them far beyond the natural limits of life. A half-burned candle stood nearby, its wax pooling in a scarred brass holder. Whoever had been reading here had done so recently. The Baron's arrival. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, soft but distinct, coming from the corridor outside. Hendrik froze, instinctively extinguishing his lantern. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until the door creaked open wider. A tall figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the faint light of the corridor. It was Nyklas von Carstein. For a moment, the Baron's gaze swept across the room, his sharp features illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through a narrow window. His eyes locked on Hendrik, who stood stiffly by the table, his hand still resting on an open book. "Ah, Master Falk," Nyklas said, his voice smooth and composed. "I see you have discovered my library." Hendrik began, but the words caught in his throat. He straightened and forced himself to meet Nyklas's gaze. "I didn't mean to intrude." The door was open, and I was curious. Nyklas stepped into the room, his movements unhurried. Curiosity is a virtue for a scholar, is it not? Knowledge must be sought wherever it lies. Hendrik gestured to the shelves. "This is an impressive collection, but some of these texts, they're dangerous, forbidden even." Nyklas's smile remained, though it seemed to harden at the edges. "Dangerous, yes, but not forbidden, at least not here. These books are relics of my family's long history. My ancestors were collectors of knowledge, fascinated by the mysteries of life and death." "Necromancy isn't just a mystery," Hendrik said cautiously. "It's a heresy, a perversion of nature." Nyklas raised an eyebrow, his tone remaining calm. "A heresy to some, to others, an art. Do not misunderstand me, Master Falk. I do not practice the arts described in these pages. I merely preserve them. History is often unpleasant, but it is no less important to remember. And yet you keep them here, accessible, as if they were waiting to be used," Hendrik said, his voice firmer now. Nyklas approached the table, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "Do you believe me to be some nefarious sorcerer, poring over these books by candlelight, plotting horrors untold. "I don't know what to believe," Hendrik admitted. "But the people of Wolfsbach are terrified, and their fear points to you." Nyklas's smile faded, replaced by a somber expression. "The people of Wolfsbach have lived in the shadow of this castle for generations. Fear is all they know. Do not mistake their superstition for truth." Hendrik stared at him, searching for any hint of deceit. Nyklas's face was unreadable, his dark eyes calm yet piercing. The Baron stepped closer to the table and gently closed the book Hendrik had been reading. "You are my guest, Master Falk," Nyklas said, his voice soft but firm. "I would prefer that you do not mistake my family's history for my intentions. But if you have questions, I will answer them, within reason." Hendrik hesitated, then nodded. "I understand, my lord. Thank you." Nyklas inclined his head. "Good. Now I suggest you return to your quarters. The hour grows late, and the castle is not a place to wander after dark." A lingering unease. Hendrik left the library with a growing weight on his mind. Nyklas's explanation was plausible, but it did little to ease his suspicion. The library was no mere archive of history. It was a treasure trove of forbidden knowledge, and the Baron's composed demeanor only deepened Hendrik's unease. As he made his way back to his quarters, the cold corridor seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The castle felt alive, as though it were watching him, waiting for him to falter. When Hendrik finally reached his room, he lit a candle and sat at the small desk by the window. He opened his journal and began to write, his pen scratching against the parchment. The Baron claims innocence, but his library tells a different story. Either he is hiding something, or he has grown too comfortable with the darkness that surrounds him. Either way, he is not a man to be trusted. Hendrik paused, staring out the window at the silhouette of the forest below. In the distance, the faint outline of Wolfsbach was barely visible through the mist. "Something is wrong here," he whispered, "and I intend to find out what." Chapter 8. The Strange Servants. The following morning, Hendrik awoke to a muted light filtering through his narrow window, casting weak rays onto the cold stone walls of his chamber. A faint knock at the door startled him. "Come in," he called. The door creaked open, and a servant entered with a silver tray balanced perfectly in her hands. Her movements were fluid yet mechanical, as if she moved to an unseen rhythm. She placed the tray on the small table by the hearth without a word. The tray held a modest breakfast, black bread, a hard cheese, and a steaming cup of tea. "Thank you," Hendrik said, studying her closely. She neither acknowledged his words nor met his gaze. The servant turned and left as quietly as she had entered, the door shutting behind her with a soft click. Hendrik frowned, unsettled by her silence. There was something peculiar about the staff at Castle Orlach. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes dull, and they moved with an unnatural grace that set his nerves on edge. It was as if they were not entirely human, or as if something vital had been stripped from them. A watchful eye. Hendrik decided to observe the castle's servants more closely. Throughout the day, he encountered them as they went about their duties, polishing the already gleaming silverware, sweeping the corridors, and lighting candles in rooms where no one sat. They moved like shadows, their footsteps silent, their faces devoid of emotion. When Hendrik tried to speak with them, they would either ignore him entirely or reply with vague monotone phrases. In the great hall, he watched as two servants carried a heavy wooden chest toward a side door. Neither of them so much as grunted under its weight, their movements eerily synchronized. Hendrik followed at a distance, but the moment they disappeared through the door, they were gone. He opened it cautiously, only to find a narrow, empty corridor leading to the kitchens. The servants were nowhere to be seen. Hendrik's unease deepened. Were they hiding something? Or were they hiding themselves? A disturbing discovery. That evening, after another tense dinner with Baron Nyklas von Carstein, Hendrik excused himself and wandered the castle under the pretense of clearing his thoughts. His true intention, however, was to learn more about the servants. He ventured toward the servants' quarters, a small, dimly lit wing near the back of the castle. The corridor smelled faintly of damp stone and tallow. As he entered, He found a row of simple wooden doors, each marked with a brass number. He opened the nearest door and peered inside. The room was sparse: a cot with a thin blanket, a plain wooden chair, and a single candle sitting on a shelf. There were no personal belongings, no clothes, no letters, no tokens of individuality. Hendrik checked several more rooms, and all were the same. It was as though the servants had no lives beyond their duties, no identities of their own. "What are you hiding, Baron?" Hendrik murmured under his breath. As he turned to leave, he heard faint footsteps approaching. He ducked into one of the empty rooms, pressing himself against the wall. Through the crack of the door, he saw two servants passing in the corridor. They moved with the same eerie grace, their faces as blank as ever. Hendrik waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before stepping out into the corridor. He decided to follow them, curiosity driving him despite the growing knot of dread in his stomach. The vanishing act. Hendrik trailed the servants at a safe distance, careful to keep to the shadows. They descended a spiral staircase that led to the lower levels of the castle, their movements unnervingly fluid even as they navigated the uneven stone steps. Hendrik followed, his lantern casting flickering light on the damp walls. The servants turned a corner, and by the time Hendrik reached it, they were gone. He found himself in a wide underground chamber, its walls lined with old barrels and crates. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of damp earth. A single wooden door stood at the far end of the room, slightly ajar. Hendrik approached the door cautiously. Peering through the crack, he saw a dimly lit passageway beyond. The sound of soft whispers drifted toward him, though he couldn't make out the words. He pushed the door open slightly wider, careful not to make a sound. The passage ended in a smaller chamber where several servants stood in a loose circle. They were motionless, their heads bowed, and the whispers had ceased. Hendrik couldn't see what they were gathered around, but his skin prickled with unease. He was about to step closer when one of the servants abruptly turned, her head snapping up to face him. Her eyes were empty, yet somehow piercing, as though she could see straight through him. Hendrik's breath caught in his throat. The servant tilted her head, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she turned back to the circle, and the whispers resumed. He didn't wait to see more. Heart pounding, he slipped back into the corridor and made his way to the upper levels as quickly and quietly as he could. A confrontation? Later that night, Hendrik sat in his chambers, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the servants' blank faces or the unnerving scene in the chamber below. Whatever was happening in Castle Orlok, it was far from ordinary. When a knock came at his door, he nearly jumped out of his chair. He opened it to find Nyklas standing there, his expression calm but his presence commanding as ever. "Master Falk," the Baron said, his tone light. "I trust you are settling in well." Hendrik hesitated. "Your castle is fascinating, my lord. There is much to explore." Nyklas's smile widened. "Indeed. Castle Orlok holds many secrets, but I would caution you against wandering too freely. Some paths are best left untrodden." Hendrik forced himself to meet the Baron's gaze. "Your servants, they are unlike any I have encountered before." Nyklas's smile did not falter, though his eyes seemed to glint in the dim light. "They are loyal. That is all that matters." "Loyalty is admirable," Hendrik said carefully, "but they seem unwell." Nyklas's expression hardened ever so slightly. "You are a guest in my home, Master Falk. My hospitality extends only so far. Do not mistake curiosity for privilege." The warning was clear, and Hendrik nodded, stepping back. "Of course, my lord. Thank you for your kindness." Nyklas inclined his head and turned, his coat billowing softly as he disappeared down the corridor. Hendrik shut the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. The Baron's words had been measured, but the threat beneath them was unmistakable. Whatever secrets Nyklas was hiding, Hendrik was certain of one thing. The servants of Castle Orlok were more than they appeared, and the answers, he feared, lay far deeper in the castle's shadowed halls than he was prepared to go. Chapter 9. The First Encounter. The stillness of the castle at night was unlike anything Hendrik had ever experienced. The air was heavy, as though the weight of centuries pressed down on the walls and floors. and even the faintest creak of stone seemed to echo endlessly in the silence. Sleep eluded him, chased away by restless thoughts and an unshakable sense of unease. It was during one of these restless nights that Hendrik first heard the sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, an eerie, low keening that seemed to come from deep within the castle. But as he sat up in bed, straining his ears, he realized it was more than just the wind. The sound was rhythmic, punctuated by soft, wet noises that made his skin crawl. It was coming from somewhere below. He hesitated, gripping the edge of his bed as he debated whether to investigate. The memory of Nyklas's warning lingered in his mind. Some paths are best left untrodden. But curiosity, mixed with a sense of duty, won out. Hendrik lit his lantern, its flickering flame casting long shadows across the stone walls, and crept out of his room, descending into the depths. The castle was a maze of corridors and staircases, and as Hendrik followed the faint sounds, he found himself descending deeper and deeper into its bowels. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint, metallic scent of damp stone filled his nostrils. His lantern barely seemed to penetrate the oppressive darkness, the shadows seeming to move and shift just beyond its glow. The noises grew louder as he reached a heavy wooden door bound with iron. It was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Hendrik pushed it open cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Beyond the door lay a long stone staircase spiraling downward into what could only be the crypts. The air was icy here, and the walls were lined with niches containing ancient, crumbling urns. At the base of the stairs, the noises grew clearer, whispers, wet sounds, and the occasional low moan. Hendrik's hand tightened on the lantern as he stepped forward. The horrifying scene. The crypt was vast, its arched ceiling supported by thick stone columns. Rows of sarcophagi lined the walls, their lids engraved with weathered symbols and inscriptions. The faint light came from torches set into sconces along the walls, their flames casting a sickly, flickering glow. Hendrik froze as he rounded a corner and saw the source of the noises. In the center of the crypt, a figure crouched over another, its movements jerky and animalistic. The crouching figure wore the tattered livery of Nyklas's servants, but its posture was grotesque, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Hendrik's breath caught as he realized the servant was feeding on the other, its mouth pressed to the neck of its victim. Blood dripped from its chin, pooling on the cold stone floor. The victim, another servant, lay motionless, their head lolling to one side. Their pale skin and half-open eyes suggested they were already beyond saving. Hendrik's first instinct was to flee, but his legs refused to move. He clutched the lantern tightly, its weak light casting a faint glow over the horrific scene. The feeding servant stopped suddenly, its head snapping up as if sensing his presence. Its face was gaunt and hollow, its eyes glassy and devoid of life. Blood smeared its mouth and dripped down its chin. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Hendrik's heart pounded in his chest, loud enough that he feared it might give him away. Then, slowly, the servant rose to its feet. Its movements were unnaturally smooth, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. It took a step toward him, fleeing in terror. Panic surged through Hendrik, breaking his paralysis. He turned and fled, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand as he sprinted back up the stairs. His boots pounded against the stone, the echoes chasing him as though the crypt itself were alive. Behind him, he could hear the faint, shuffling footsteps of the servant pursuing him. Hendrik didn't dare look back. His lungs burned as he climbed, his mind racing with questions. What had he just seen? What kind of creature could do such a thing? By the time he reached the upper levels of the castle, the pursuit had stopped. He slammed the door behind him and leaned against it, his chest heaving. The cold sweat on his brow made the night air feel even more frigid. A fractured truth. Hendrik staggered back to his chambers, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. He latched the door behind him and slumped into the chair by his desk, staring blankly at the flickering candle. He had seen strange things during his travels, signs of heresy, tales of dark magic. But this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The servant's gaunt face and bloodied mouth haunted his mind, and the memory of the lifeless victim lying in the crypt sent chills down his spine. He opened his journal with shaking hands, the quill scratching against the parchment as he tried to record his thoughts. Journal entry, midnight. I witnessed something tonight. Something I cannot explain. One of the Baron's servants feeding on another. Not like an animal, but like something worse. A creature. A thing. The villagers spoke of pale figures returning from the woods, changed. I dismissed it as superstition, but now I wonder if they were right. What is Nyklas hiding in this castle? His servants move like shadows, and his answers to my questions are too perfect, too polished. There is something unnatural here, something I cannot yet name. As Hendrik closed the journal, the shadows in the room seemed to press closer, their edges shifting unnaturally in the dim candlelight. He felt as though the castle was watching him, its walls alive with secrets he wasn't meant to uncover. He extinguished the lantern and crawled into bed, though sleep did not come easily. The crypt's horrors replayed in his mind over and over, and the image of the servant's blood-streaked face burned itself into his memory. Far below, deep in the castle's forgotten halls, the crypt lay silent once more. But Hendrik knew he had seen something that would change the course of his investigation, and perhaps his life, forever. Chapter 10. Escape to Wolfsbach. The air in Hendrik's chambers felt heavier than before, oppressive and cold, as though the castle itself had turned against him. Sleep had not come, nor had clarity. The horrors of the crypt replayed endlessly in his mind, the gaunt, bloodied face of the servant, the lifeless body of its victim, and the eerie, unnatural silence that followed his retreat. He couldn't stay. Every instinct screamed that Castle Orlach was a place of danger, its shadows hiding truths far darker than he could have imagined. Gripping his satchel and the lantern that had accompanied him through the labyrinthine halls, Hendrik made his decision. The flight begins. Hendrik moved quickly, but quietly, slipping out of his chambers and into the dim corridors of the castle. The flickering torches along the walls cast dancing shadows, each one making him flinch as he imagined the sound of footsteps behind him. He had memorized the route back to the main gates, but the castle seemed different now, its halls longer and its turns more convoluted. The familiar path twisted in unfamiliar ways, and he cursed under his breath, wondering if his fear had muddled his memory or if the castle itself was conspiring to keep him within its grasp. The silent servants were absent from the halls, their usual eerie presence replaced by an unnerving stillness. Hendrik wondered if they, too, were watching, lurking just out of sight. His hand instinctively tightened on the silver coins Otto had given him, as though they might offer some protection. At last he reached the grand entry hall. The massive iron doors loomed ahead, their edges gleaming faintly in the pale light of the torches. But as he approached, Hendrik froze. The doors were barred shut, thick chains draped across them, and fastened with a heavy lock. Panic began to set in, his breathing quickening as he scanned the room. A smaller side door caught his eye, one that Nyklas's servants had used earlier to carry supplies. Hendrik darted toward it, pushing it open just enough to slip through. The forest path. The side door led to a narrow path that wound its way down the cliffs on which Castle Orlach stood. The path was steep and treacherous, lined with jagged rocks and loose gravel. Hendrik descended carefully, his lantern casting faint light on the uneven ground. Above him, the castle loomed like a specter, its spires silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The forest at the base of the cliffs seemed almost alive, its trees twisting into unnatural shapes and their branches clawing at the sky. Hendrik hesitated only briefly before plunging into the undergrowth, his heart racing as he imagined the crypt's horrors following him. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. Yet Hendrik couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to move with him, dark shapes flitting between the trees just beyond the edge of his lantern's glow. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps reached his ears, slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. Hendrik's pulse quickened. He extinguished his lantern, plunging himself into darkness, and crouched behind a tree, his breath shallow and his hand clutching the silver coins. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, There was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, from the direction of the castle, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Hendrik didn't wait to find out what it was. He bolted, branches whipping against his face as he ran. His feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but he didn't dare slow down. The growl came again, closer this time, and he thought he could hear the faint rustle of something large moving through the underbrush behind him. The safety of Wolfsbach. By the time Hendrik emerged from the forest, the first pale light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. He stumbled into the village square, his legs burning and his lungs aching from the effort. The sight of the crumbling buildings of Wolfsbach, familiar and haunting, was a small comfort. The villagers were already stirring, though they froze when they saw him. A small crowd gathered as Hendrik collapsed against the dry fountain in the center of the square, struggling to catch his breath. "Scholar Falk," Otto said, stepping forward cautiously. "What happened?" Hendrik raised his head, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Castle Orlach," he rasped. Something is wrong in that place." "The servants, the crypts." He shook his head, his voice trembling. "They aren't human." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. An older woman muttered a prayer under her breath, and a man clutched a small talisman around his neck. "You know," Hendrik said, his voice rising with desperation, "you all know, don't you? About the Baron, about what he is." The crowd stirred, their fear palpable. Otto hesitated, glancing at the others before finally speaking. "We told you, Scholar," he said quietly. "The Baron knows all. He always has." "He knows what?" Hendrik demanded. "Speak plainly." The villagers looked to one another, their expressions a mix of fear and resignation. At last Otto stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He's no man, Falk. He never was. The Baron is a creature of the night, a vampire." Hendrik stared at him, the word echoing in his mind. It was absurd, impossible, yet the memories of the crypt, the lifeless servants, and the Baron's unsettling presence all surged to the forefront of his thoughts. "I should have left," Otto continued. "Years ago we all should have. But where would we go? This is our home, even if it's cursed. And the Baron, he doesn't let people leave." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Hendrik asked, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. "Would you have believed us?" Otto replied. "You're a man of Sigmar, of reason. You'd have dismissed it as superstition like everyone else." Hendrik had no answer. He rose shakily to his feet, his mind racing. The villagers were right, he wouldn't have believed them. Even now, the idea seemed impossible. And yet the evidence was undeniable. The Baron's words echoed in his mind. "Sylvania is a place of shadows. Those who dwell here understand that to survive, one must embrace the darkness." Hendrik looked toward the forest, where the distant silhouette of Castle Orlach loomed against the morning sky. His fear was now matched by a grim resolve. Whatever secrets the Baron was hiding, whatever horrors lurked within those ancient walls, he would uncover the truth. "Nyklas von Carstein," Hendrik murmured, gripping the edge of the fountain. "I'll find out what you are." The villagers said nothing, their silence a testament to their shared dread. And as the sun rose higher, casting pale light over the cursed village of Wolfsbach, Hendrik knew his journey had only just begun. Chapter 11. The Witch Hunter's Arrival. The chill of early morning lingered in the air as Hendrik sat in the corner of the Howling Hound, the small village inn in Wolfsbach. The warmth of the hearth was a welcome reprieve after his harrowing escape from Castle Orlach, but it did little to ease the growing weight of his thoughts. Nyklas von Carstein, a vampire. The word felt absurd even as it sat at the forefront of Hendrik's mind, but the evidence left little room for doubt. And yet, what could he, a mere scholar, do against such a creature? The villagers had spoken of their fear, their helplessness. Hendrik now shared that dread, though he refused to let it paralyze him. If the Church of Sigmar had sent him here, there must have been some purpose beyond mere observation. The door to the inn creaked open, and the faint sound of boots on the wooden floor pulled Hendrik from his thoughts. He turned to see a tall figure stepping inside, silhouetted against the gray morning light. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat that swept the ground as he moved. The distinctive twin-tailed comet of Sigmar gleamed on a heavy medallion at his chest, and a pistol and rapier hung from his belt. His sharp eyes scanned the room, landing on Hendrik with an intensity that made him freeze. The witch hunter. The man strode across the room, his boots heavy against the creaking floorboards. As he approached, Hendrik noticed the scar running diagonally across his face, a jagged mark that lent his stern expression an even grimmer edge. "You," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "You're the scholar from Altdorf, aren't you?" "I am," Hendrik replied, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. "And you are?" "Lucas Dietrich, witch hunter of the Church of Sigmar." He didn't extend his hand. "I've been tracking a trail of death through Sylvania. The last lead I followed brought me here. What do you know about the disappearances?" Hendrik hesitated, weighing his words carefully. Witch hunters were notoriously ruthless, their zeal for rooting out heresy often leading them to act before fully understanding a situation. The last thing Hendrik needed was to be mistaken for an enemy. "I know they are connected to Baron Nyklas von Carstein," Hendrik said carefully. "I believe he is responsible for what's happening here." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "You believe, or you know?" "I've seen things that defy explanation," Hendrik admitted. "The Baron's servants, they aren't human. And there are signs of something darker within the castle. The villagers believe him to be a vampire." For a long moment, Lucas said nothing. Then he pulled out a chair and sat across from Hendrik, his movements deliberate. "If the Baron is a vampire, why are you still alive? Thralls don't often get the luxury of roaming free." Hendrik stiffened. "I am no thrall." "Forgive me if I don't take you at your word," Lucas said coldly. "Nyklas von Carstein is a name I've heard whispered by the survivors of his wake. If you've come from his castle, you've been in his presence. That alone is enough to warrant suspicion." "I escaped," Hendrik said firmly. "If I were under his control, why would I be here? Why would I warn the villagers?" "Perhaps to lure them into his grasp," Lucas countered. His hand rested on the hilt of his rapier, his fingers drumming against the pommel. "Vampires are cunning. They use pawns to spread their influence. You might not even know you're one of them." Hendrik's patience was wearing thin. "If I were a thrall, I'd hardly be sitting here explaining myself. I came to Wolfsbach to uncover the truth, just as you have." Lucas studied him, his gaze sharp and unwavering. At last he leaned back in his chair, though his hand remained on the rapier. "If you're lying, I'll know soon enough. But for now, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt." "Generous of you," Hendrik muttered, his relief tempered by annoyance. The growing threat. The tension between them eased slightly as they began to share information. Hendrik recounted his findings at Castle Orlach, the eerie silence of the servants, the horrific scene in the crypt, and Nyklas's unsettling charm. Lucas listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. "The signs are clear," Lucas said when Hendrik finished. "Nyklas is no mere man. His lineage, his behavior, and the fear he commands, it all points to one thing. He is a von Carstein." "A von Carstein?" Hendrik repeated, unfamiliar with the name. "The von Carsteins are a cursed bloodline," Lucas explained. "Vampires of great power and ambition. Sylvania has been their hunting ground for centuries. Most are long dead, but their legacy remains." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And those who remain are as dangerous as their forebears." Hendrik felt a chill run down his spine. "If Nyklas is truly one of them, what can we do?" "We destroy him," Lucas said simply. "But that's easier said than done. Vampires don't die easily, especially not those of the von Carstein bloodline. They have powers beyond mortal understanding, control over the undead, regeneration, and an array of dark magic. To face one unprepared is to court death." "Then we must prepare," Hendrik said. "I've seen enough to know that Nyklas is growing bolder. If we don't act, he'll claim more lives." "Agreed," Lucas said, rising from his seat. "We'll need weapons, silver fire, holy artifacts, and information. If Nyklas has a weakness, we must find it." An easy alliance. As they left the inn, the villagers watched from a distance, their fear evident in their wary gazes. Hendrik couldn't blame them. They had lived under Nyklas's shadow for generations, their lives shaped by his silent dominion. But with Lucas's arrival, a flicker of hope stirred in their eyes. "Keep watch over the village," Lucas instructed Otto before turning to Hendrik. "I'll scout the area for signs of Nyklas's influence. You'll assist me. If you're as knowledgeable as you claim, you might be useful." "And if I'm not?" Hendrik asked dryly. "Then I'll kill you myself," Lucas said without hesitation. Hendrik stared at him, uncertain if the witch hunter was joking. But there was no humor in Lucas's expression, only grim resolve. Hendrik nodded, accepting the reality of their uneasy partnership. They had a common enemy, and for now, that would have to be enough. As they set out together, Hendrik couldn't help but glance toward the distant silhouette of Castle Orlok. The spires of the fortress rose against the horizon like jagged teeth, a reminder of the darkness that awaited them. "Nyklas von Carstein," Lucas muttered under his breath. "Your time is coming." Hendrik hoped the witch hunter was right. But as they ventured into the cursed land of Sylvania, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Baron was already several steps ahead. Chapter 12. The Sigmarite Refuge. The ruined chapel stood at the edge of the village, half shrouded in mist. Its crooked steeple leaned precariously to one side, and the stone walls were cracked and weathered, vines creeping through the gaps like invasive fingers. The twin-tailed comet of Sigmar, though tarnished and missing chunks of its form, still hung defiantly above the arched doorway, its presence a faint reminder of hope in an otherwise desolate place. "This is the refuge?" Hendrik asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It's more than it seems," Lucas Dietrich replied, striding toward the entrance. "Father Albrecht has served Sigmar longer than most of us have been alive. If anyone knows the truth about Nyklas von Carstein, it's him." Hendrik followed reluctantly, his gaze sweeping over the crumbling structure. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of melted tallow and aged incense. Candles flickered in their holders along the walls, their weak flames barely illuminating the space. At the far end of the chapel, an elderly man knelt before the altar, his back bent in fervent prayer. The aged priest. "Father Albrecht," Lucas called, his voice low but commanding. The old priest turned, revealing a weathered face lined with age and burden. His hands, calloused and trembling, clutched a well-worn hammer pendant, the sacred symbol of Sigmar. "Lucas," the priest said, rising slowly to his feet. His voice was raspy but firm. "I feared you would come too late." Albrecht's gaze shifted to Hendrik, narrowing slightly. "And this one?" "A scholar." "Sent by the church," Lucas said curtly. "He's seen what we're dealing with." The priest studied Hendrik for a long moment before nodding. "Then perhaps Sigmar has not abandoned us yet." Albrecht gestured for them to sit on the wooden benches near the altar. The room was sparse, its once grand tapestries reduced to tattered remnants, but the sense of sanctity remained. The altar itself was carved from stone, etched with faded inscriptions invoking Sigmar's protection. "You know of Nyklas von Carstein?" Lucas said without preamble. Albrecht sighed heavily, lowering himself onto the bench. "Nyklas, yes. A name that brings shame to these lands. The von Carstein legacy." "Nyklas is of the von Carstein bloodline," Albrecht began, his voice carrying the weight of years. "But compared to the infamous lords of his house, he is a lesser figure. Not a Vlad, nor a Conrad, nor even a Manfred. He does not wield armies or seek dominion over empires. But make no mistake, he is no less dangerous." "What makes him different?" Hendrik asked, leaning forward. "Ambition," Albrecht replied, his gaze distant. "Nyklas has always been patient, cunning. He does not seek open war, but influence. He builds his strength in the shadows, feeding off the people's fear and despair. And unlike the others, he cares for no legacy but his own. His loyalty to the von Carstein name is tenuous at best." "Then why haven't the other vampires dealt with him?" Lucas asked, his tone sharp. "The von Carsteins don't tolerate competition." "Perhaps because he is insignificant in their eyes," Albrecht said. "Or perhaps because they do not know his plans." Nyklas has long preferred to keep to himself, building power in this forgotten corner of Sylvania. But there are whispers, rumors that he seeks an artifact, one that could elevate him beyond even the likes of Vlad or Manfred. Hendrik felt a chill run down his spine. An artifact? What kind? The villagers call it the Soulstone of Lahmia, Albrecht said grimly. A relic of the first vampires, said to hold the essence of their cursed power. If Nyklas has found it, or even come close to it, the consequences could be catastrophic. A moment of doubt. Hendrik glanced at Lucas, who was silent, his expression grim. If Nyklas is building his strength, Hendrik said, and if he has access to such a relic, how do we stop him? We stop him the way we always do, Lucas said coldly, with fire and faith. Albrecht shook his head slowly. It is not so simple. Vampires of the von Carstein bloodline cannot be killed by mortal means. Even if you pierce his heart, he will rise again, unless the proper rites are performed. Then what do you suggest? Lucas asked, his voice laced with impatience. Nyklas's connection to his power must be severed, Albrecht said. Destroy the Soulstone, and you weaken him. Only then can he be truly destroyed. But to do that, he hesitated, his hands tightening around the hammer pendant. You would have to return to Castle Orlok. Hendrik's stomach churned at the thought. The crypt, the servants, the oppressive darkness. It was the last place he wanted to go. But as Albrecht's words sank in, he realized there was no alternative. Is there anything else you can tell us about the Soulstone? Hendrik asked. Only that it is bound to the castle, Albrecht replied. Legends say it was brought there centuries ago, hidden deep within its vaults. Its power feeds the land, corrupting it, and in turn, feeds Nyklas. A plan forms. Lucas rose from the bench, his hand resting on the hilt of his rapier. Then we know what must be done. We find the Soulstone and destroy it. And how do you propose we get past Nyklas and his thralls? Hendrik asked, his voice rising with frustration. We barely escaped last time. Lucas turned to him, his expression cold. We prepare. Albrecht has the blessings and relics we need, and this time we don't run. Albrecht nodded, though his face was heavy with concern. I will do what I can to aid you. Sigmar's light will be your shield, but you must tread carefully. Nyklas is no fool. He will know you are coming. Hendrik felt the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him, heavier than anything he had faced before. He glanced at the worn altar, its inscriptions barely visible in the dim light, and drew a deep breath. If Nyklas has the Soulstone, Hendrik said, his voice steady despite his fear, then we cannot allow him to keep it. Whatever it takes, we stop him. Whatever it takes, Lucas echoed. As they left the chapel, the faint sound of Albrecht's prayers followed them into the misty air. The priest knelt once more before the altar, his voice rising in solemn invocation. Sigmar protect them, he murmured, his hammer pendant glinting faintly in the candlelight, and may his light guide them through the darkness. Chapter 13. Nyklas's Plans. The candlelight in the chapel flickered as Father Albrecht leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on the altar. The air was heavy with incense and the weight of what he was about to reveal. Hendrik and Lucas Dietrich stood before him, their expressions tense, the gravity of their task hanging heavily between them. You spoke of the Soulstone of Lahmia, Hendrik said, breaking the silence. If it's as powerful as you claim, why would Nyklas pursue something so dangerous? Surely he risks drawing the attention of others, even his own kind. Albrecht sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the twin-tailed comet etched into the altar. Nyklas has never been like the other von Carsteins, he began. The great lords of his bloodline, Vlad Manfred, they sought open conquest, the subjugation of empires. Nyklas, however, has always preferred subtlety. He operates in the shadows, influencing rather than conquering outright. But the Soulstone changes everything. The Soulstone of Lahmia. What exactly is this artifact? Lucas asked, his tone sharp and impatient. You said it amplifies his power. But what does that mean? The Soulstone of Lahmia, Albrecht said, is a relic tied to the origin of vampirism itself. It is said to have been created by the first vampires, the disciples of Queen Neferata, using the dark magic of Nagash. It holds a fragment of the power they wielded, a link to the dark magic that sustains the undead. He paused, his voice lowering. For someone like Nyklas, the Soulstone is more than a weapon. It is a gateway. With it, he can amplify his necromantic powers far beyond their natural limits. He could raise armies of the dead with a mere thought, dominate the will of mortals, and even defy the few weaknesses his kind still possess. Lucas frowned. And if he has already found it? Then his strength will only grow, Albrecht said grimly, and his ambitions will not stop at Sylvania. Nyklas's vision. Hendrik's breath caught. You're saying he plans to leave Sylvania? Albrecht nodded. The von Carsteins have long ruled this cursed land, content to let the rest of the empire forget them. But Nyklas seeks more. He has no interest in the grand battles and open wars of his ancestors. He would see the empire fall from within, one village, one province, one soul at a time. He would spread his corruption like a plague, leaving no corner untouched. Lucas's hand rested on the hilt of his rapier, his expression dark, and the Soulstone gives him the power to do it. Yes, Albrecht said. And worse still, it is tied to Castle Orlok itself. The legends say the stone was brought there centuries ago, hidden in its deepest vaults by one of Nyklas's ancestors. Its power has seeped into the land, corrupting it, and Nyklas has spent decades searching for it. But if the legends are true, Hendrik interjected, why didn't Nyklas use the Soulstone before now? Because the stone is dormant, Albrecht explained. Its power must be awakened through a ritual, one that requires great preparation and sacrifice. I fear that Nyklas is nearing the end of that preparation. If he succeeds, the Soulstone will not only empower him, it will anchor his dominion over death itself. A growing threat. The room fell silent as the weight of Albrecht's words settled over them. Hendrik's mind raced, piecing together the implications. The disappearances in Wolfsbach, the pale and hollow servants of Castle Orlok, the blood-drained livestock, it all pointed to a single, horrifying conclusion. The disappearances, Hendrik said slowly, his voice tight. They're part of the ritual, aren't they? Albrecht nodded. The Soulstone feeds on death, but not just any death. The victims must be drained of their vitality, their life force consumed to fuel its power. Nyklas has been using the villagers as sacrifices. Then we have no time to waste, Lucas said, his voice hard. If he's close to completing the ritual, we must act now. Hendrik hesitated. But how? We barely escaped the castle last time. Even if we find the Soulstone, how do we destroy it? Albrecht turned to the altar, his hands trembling as he lifted a small, iron-bound chest from beneath it. He set it on the stone surface and opened it, revealing a weathered hammer engraved with intricate runes. The symbol of the twin-tailed comet gleamed faintly in the dim light. This, he said, lifting the hammer carefully, is Sigmar's light. It was blessed by the high priest centuries ago, a weapon forged to destroy the unholy. It can shatter the Soulstone, severing its connection to the mortal realm. Hendrik reached out to touch the hammer, but Albrecht stopped him. It is not enough to merely strike the stone, the priest said. The blow must be delivered at a place of sanctity, a site where Sigmar's light can pierce the darkness. That is the only way to ensure the Soulstone's destruction. The plan forms. Castle Orlok is the last place anyone would call sanctified, Lucas said bitterly. There is one place, Albrecht said. The crypt of Sigmar, hidden beneath the ruins of an ancient chapel near Castle Orlok. It is said to be a holy site, blessed by Sigmar himself. If you can reach it, you can destroy the Soulstone. And what of Nyklas? Hendrik asked. He won't let us take it without a fight. Nyklas will be weakened if the Soulstone is removed from his grasp, Albrecht said. But he will still be dangerous. You must be prepared to face him. Silver, holy water, and this hammer, these are your only weapons against him. A final warning. As they prepared to leave, Albrecht placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder. You must understand, this will not be an easy task. Nyklas is cunning, and he will know you are coming. The closer you get to the Soulstone, the more his power will grow. You must have faith, Master Falk. Sigmar's light will guide you." Hendrik nodded, though his heart was heavy with doubt. Faith had never been his strongest virtue, but he knew that without it, they had little hope of succeeding. Lucas slung his weapons over his shoulder, his expression grim. "We go at first light. If we wait any longer, there won't be a village left to save." As they left the chapel, the ruins loomed behind them, a fragile sanctuary in the midst of a cursed land. The path ahead was treacherous, the stakes higher than Hendrik could have imagined. But one thing was certain: Nyklas von Carstein's plans could not be allowed to come to fruition. And as the first stars appeared in the darkened sky, Hendrik steeled himself for the battle ahead. Chapter 14. Nyklas's Reach. The early morning mist clung to the fields and forests surrounding Wolfsbach as Hendrik, Lucas, and Father Albrecht prepared to investigate the rumors spreading through the region. Word of entire villages disappearing had reached them in hushed whispers from the villagers, alongside tales of unnatural creatures roaming the woods and fields. The evidence suggested one thing: Nyklas von Carstein was no longer content with hiding in the shadows. "He's mobilizing," Lucas said as they walked the narrow, rutted path leading toward one of the nearby villages. His tone was grim, and his hand rested on the hilt of his rapier. "This is no longer about sacrifices for the Soulstone. Nyklas is preparing for war." "But why now?" Hendrik asked. "He's lived in relative obscurity for decades. Why reveal himself now, just as the Soulstone nears completion?" "Because once it's active, he'll have no need for secrecy," Lucas replied. "And by the time we realize his full strength, it will be too late." Father Albrecht walked behind them, his hammer pendant clutched tightly in his hand. "Nyklas's power is tied to fear. The disappearances, the undead, they're not just practical. They're meant to break the will of the people." The empty village. Their first stop was Eichenhof, a small farming village nestled at the edge of the forest. When they arrived, the silence was deafening. The fields lay fallow, the crops withering as if drained of life. The houses stood intact, their doors ajar and windows dark. "This place should be bustling," Hendrik said, his voice hushed. "It's harvest season." "Stay close," Lucas ordered, drawing his pistol. He led the group into the village square, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. The scene was eerily familiar to Hendrik, reminiscent of the abandoned farmstead he had investigated weeks earlier. Tools lay scattered in the dirt, carts overturned, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. They approached the village well, its rope frayed and dangling, as if someone had tried to climb down. Lucas knelt, inspecting the ground. "Tracks," he said, "boots, leading toward the forest." "And these?" Hendrik asked, pointing to another set of prints. They were larger, clawed, and partially embedded in the soft earth. Hendrik felt a chill run down his spine. "Those aren't human." "No," Lucas said grimly. "They're not." Father Albrecht moved to one of the houses and stepped inside cautiously. Moments later, he called out, "Come quickly." Hendrik and Lucas followed him into the house, their lanterns illuminating the dark interior. A family of 4 sat at the dinner table, their bodies slumped as if asleep. But their skin was pale and waxy, and their eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "They weren't killed," Hendrik whispered, his voice trembling. "It's like they were, drained." "Nyklas is doing," Albrecht said solemnly. "He doesn't need to kill his victims outright. Sometimes he takes just enough to leave them like this, soulless husks." Lucas examined the bodies carefully. "This isn't just about feeding, he's leaving a message." The forest of undeath. As they followed the tracks into the forest, the air grew colder, the trees pressing closer together, as though trying to block out the light. The ground was littered with broken branches and trampled undergrowth, signs of something large moving through the area. Hendrik clutched his satchel tightly, his fingers brushing against the holy relics Father Albrecht had given him. The unease he had felt since entering Sylvania was now a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. The first sign of the undead came as they approached a clearing. A low growl echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet on dry leaves. Lucas raised a hand, signaling them to stop. Ahead, a figure staggered into view, A man in tattered clothing, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. His skin was ashen, his movements jerky, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "Sigmar preserve us," Albrecht muttered. Lucas didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The zombie collapsed to the ground, a gaping hole where its head had been. "Keep moving," Lucas said, reloading his pistol with practiced ease. "That won't be the only one." He was right. As they pushed deeper into the forest, more undead emerged from the shadows, men, women, and even children, their lifeless bodies animated by Nyklas's dark magic. Some stumbled toward them clumsily, while others moved with disturbing speed, their jaws snapping as they lunged. Hendrik swung his lantern wildly, the flame flickering as he struggled to keep them at bay. Albrecht recited prayers, his voice rising as he held his hammer pendant high. The holy symbol glowed faintly, the power of Sigmar repelling the undead long enough for Lucas to cut them down. "Why so many?" Hendrik asked, panting as they stopped to catch their breath. "Nyklas must know we're coming." "He doesn't care," Lucas said, his face grim. "This isn't about us. He's raising an army." The monstrosities. As they emerged from the forest into a large clearing, the sight before them stopped them cold. The clearing was filled with corpses, not just human, but animal as well. Wolves, deer, and even livestock lay scattered across the ground, their bodies broken and twisted. Yet they weren't still. Their limbs twitched, their heads jerked, and their eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. Nyklas's magic was animating them into grotesque monstrosities, their bodies reshaped into forms designed for battle. A wolf with elongated claws and exposed bones snarled at them, its spine arching unnaturally. A deer with sharpened antlers charged, its movements erratic but unnervingly fast. "They're experiments," Hendrik said, horrified. "Nyklas is testing his power." Lucas raised his rapier, his expression hard. "Then we end this now." The clearing erupted into chaos as the monstrosities attacked. Lucas moved with precision, his blade flashing, as he struck down one creature after another. Albrecht's prayers filled the air, the light from his hammer pendant burning away the unholy energy animating the creatures. Hendrik fought to stay out of reach, using his lantern to blind and disorient the attackers. When the last creature fell, the clearing was silent once more, save for the sound of their labored breathing. The bodies lay in heaps, their corrupted forms slowly disintegrating into ash. A grim revelation. As they regrouped, Lucas inspected one of the corpses. "These are just scouts," he said. "Nyklas is testing his strength, but he hasn't unleashed his full force yet." "And when he does?" Hendrik asked, his voice heavy with dread. "Then Sylvania will burn," Lucas said. "And if he crosses the border into the Empire, the devastation will be unimaginable." Albrecht knelt beside one of the bodies, his face pale. "The Soulstone amplifies his power, yes, but it also amplifies his reach. These creatures are just the beginning. If Nyklas completes the ritual, he could raise the dead across all of Sylvania and beyond." Hendrik felt a wave of nausea, the enormity of their task settling over him like a weight. They weren't just fighting to stop Nyklas. They were fighting to prevent an apocalypse. "Then we have no choice," Hendrik said. "We must destroy the Soulstone before it's too late." Lucas nodded, his jaw set. "Then we prepare. This isn't a battle we can afford to lose." As they made their way back to Wolfsbach, the distant silhouette of Castle Orlok loomed on the horizon, its jagged spires a reminder of the darkness waiting for them. Hendrik clenched his fists, his fear now tempered by a growing resolve. Nyklas's reach had to be stopped, no matter the cost. Chapter 15. Into the Wirewood. The Wirewood loomed before them, its gnarled trees twisting together like the ribs of some ancient beast. The forest exhaled a palpable sense of dread, the air within unnaturally cold and thick with the smell of decaying leaves. Hendrik hesitated at the edge, the shadowy depths of the cursed woods seeming to shift and writhe as if alive. "This place has a reputation for swallowing men whole," Hendrik said, his voice low. "Are we certain the relic is worth the risk?" "It's not a matter of worth," Father Albrecht replied, clutching his hammer pendant tightly. "If we are to face Nyklas, we need every advantage. The Lantern of Sanctity was blessed by Sigmar himself. Its light can repel darkness, even that which no mortal weapon can touch." "And if it isn't there?" Hendrik asked. "Then we'll die with nothing to show for it," Lucas Dietrich said bluntly. "Now move." Hendrik cast a wary glance at the witch hunter before stepping into the forest. The ancient, twisting trees closed in around them, their branches clawing at the sky and blotting out the sunlight. The faint, eerie whisper of wind moved through the leaves, though the air itself was still. The forest curse. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the forest became. The trees grew thicker, their trunks covered in strange, glowing fungi. The ground was soft and spongy, the undergrowth littered with bones, animal and otherwise. Hendrik's lantern provided little comfort, its flickering light casting distorted shadows that seemed to reach out toward them. "What exactly are we looking for?" Hendrik asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The lantern will be in a shrine," Albrecht said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "It was built centuries ago to protect the relic. But the wirewood is alive. It will not give it up easily." As if on cue, a low groan reverberated through the forest, the sound like the creaking of ancient wood. Hendrik froze, his heart pounding as he searched the darkness for the source. The groan grew louder, turning into a guttural, inhuman growl. "Stay close," Lucas ordered, drawing his rapier. "The forest is watching us." Hendrik's hand tightened around the handle of his lantern as they pressed forward, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the spongy earth. The growling faded, but the forest's oppressive presence only seemed to intensify. The spirits awaken. After what felt like hours of navigating the twisting paths, they came upon a clearing. At its center stood a crumbling stone shrine, its surface covered in moss and engraved with faded runes. Atop the altar sat a lantern of intricate design, its golden frame glowing faintly with an inner light. "The Lantern of Sanctity," Albrecht breathed, stepping forward. But as they moved closer, the air grew colder, and a strange mist began to seep from the ground. Hendrik felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as whispers filled the air, unintelligible and echoing, as though spoken by 100 voices at once. "Something's coming," Lucas warned, his pistol drawn. The mist coalesced into shapes, vague humanoid figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. Their movements were jerky, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings, and their forms flickered like candlelight. "Spirits," Albrecht said, his voice firm, corrupted by the forest's curse. The spirits surged forward, their whispering voices rising into a deafening wail. Lucas fired his pistol, the shot tearing through one of the figures, but it reformed almost instantly. Hendrik swung his lantern wildly, its light scattering the spirits temporarily, but they pressed on, undeterred. "Sigmar, guide us," Albrecht shouted, holding his hammer pendant aloft. It glowed with a brilliant golden light, the spirits recoiling as the holy power washed over them. But the glow began to fade, and Albrecht staggered under the effort. "We can't hold them off forever," Hendrik shouted. "Get the lantern." Claiming the relic. Lucas darted forward, his movements precise as he cut through the spirits blocking his path. He reached the shrine and grabbed the lantern, its golden glow intensifying as his hand closed around it. The spirits howled in pain, their forms flickering violently. "Go! Now!" Lucas shouted, brandishing the lantern as the spirits writhed and clawed at him. Hendrik and Albrecht rushed to his side, the light of the lantern creating a protective barrier around them. Together, they retreated toward the edge of the clearing, the spirits' howls fading as the relic's power drove them back. But the forest wasn't finished with them. The ground trembled, and the trees seemed to shift, their branches twisting into claw-like shapes. The path they had entered through was gone, replaced by a tangle of roots and thorns. "We're trapped," Hendrik said, his voice rising with panic. "No," Lucas said, holding the lantern high. Its light pierced the darkness, revealing a narrow, winding path through the trees. "This way." A narrow escape. The trio ran, the light of the lantern carving a path through the forest's cursed embrace. The whispers grew louder, the spirits reappearing at the edges of the light, but they dared not approach. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and ripple, and Hendrik stumbled more than once, his breath ragged as he struggled to keep up. At last they broke through the tree line, the oppressive weight of the wordwood lifting as they emerged into the open air. Hendrik collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, while Lucas and Albrecht turned to face the forest. The spirits lingered at the edge, their hollow eyes watching, but they did not cross into the light of the lantern. "Sigmar preserve us," Albrecht whispered, his voice heavy with relief. Hendrik rose shakily to his feet, his hands trembling. That was not natural. "Nothing in Sylvania is," Lucas said, his voice hard. He held up the lantern, its glow steady and strong. "But now we have this. Nyklas's magic won't be able to touch us as long as we wield it." "And yet the forest let us go," Hendrik said, his brow furrowed. "Why?" Lucas didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Castle Orlok. The lantern's light reflected in his sharp gaze, its golden glow a faint beacon against the encroaching darkness. "Whatever the reason," Lucas said, "this was only the beginning." As they began their trek back to Wolfsbach, the wordwood loomed behind them, its cursed whispers fading into silence. The lantern of sanctity was theirs, but the cost of wielding it, and the dangers they still faced, remained uncertain. Chapter 16. A Town Under Siege. The distant sound of a tolling bell reached them as they approached the outskirts of Dunkelwald, the town shrouded in the haze of dusk. Hendrik quickened his pace, his eyes narrowing as he noticed faint wisps of smoke rising above the rooftops. The bell's rhythmic clang was accompanied by muffled shouts and the unmistakable clash of steel. "This isn't a drill," Lucas Dietrich said grimly, drawing his rapier and pistol. "The town's under attack." "What could Nyklas hope to gain from attacking a place like this?" Hendrik asked, his breath quickening. "Fear," Father Albrecht said, his hammer pendant clutched tightly in one hand. "Fear and chaos. If the people lose hope, Nyklas doesn't need to fight them. They'll hand themselves over willingly." "Then we can't let that happen," Lucas said, his tone sharp. "Stay close. The battle begins." They entered Dunkelwald to find it in chaos. The main street was littered with overturned carts and the bodies of villagers and soldiers alike. The undead surged through the town, clawing at doors and windows as they pursued the terrified townsfolk. Zombies in tattered clothing shambled through the streets, their lifeless eyes glowing faintly. Among them were larger, more monstrous creatures, stitched together abominations of flesh and bone, their twisted forms reeking of decay. "Sigmar protect us," Albrecht muttered as he raised his hammer pendant. Its faint glow gave Hendrik a shred of courage as he followed Lucas into the fray. Lucas moved like a whirlwind, his rapier flashing as he dispatched one zombie after another. He aimed his pistol at a hulking abomination and fired, the silver-tipped bullet tearing through its skull and sending it collapsing to the ground. Albrecht stood at the center of the group, his prayers ringing out as the light of Sigmar repelled the undead, forcing them to hesitate. Hendrik, though no warrior, swung his lantern desperately, the relic's blessed light scattering nearby zombies. He struck one creature across the face, its rotted flesh sizzling as the holy glow burned through it. "Form a line," Lucas shouted to the remaining town guards who were rallying near the town square. "Keep them from flanking us." The guards, though weary and bloodied, obeyed, locking their shields together to create a barrier. The villagers who could still fight joined them, wielding pitchforks and makeshift weapons. A desperate defense. The undead pressed forward, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the defenders. Hendrik felt his arms grow heavy as he swung the lantern again and again, the light warding off the attackers but draining his strength. Nearby, Lucas fought with ruthless efficiency, his movements precise and calculated. "We can't hold them forever," Hendrik shouted, his voice hoarse. "We don't need to," Lucas replied, reloading his pistol. "We just need to buy the villagers time to escape." Albrecht stepped forward, his voice rising in a booming prayer. "By Sigmar's light, I banish you." The pendant around his neck blazed with golden light, and a wave of holy energy swept through the street, incinerating the nearest undead. The abominations shrieked and recoiled, but the horde behind them pressed on undeterred. "Fall back to the chapel," Lucas ordered. "It's defensible, and the villagers can take refuge there." The defenders retreated, forming a tight line as they moved toward the small stone chapel at the center of the town. Hendrik helped usher frightened villagers inside, their terrified faces pale and streaked with tears. The chapel holds. The chapel became a fortress, its thick stone walls and narrow windows providing some measure of protection. Lucas and the guards barred the doors, while Hendrik and Albrecht worked to calm the panicked villagers. "We can't keep them out forever," Lucas said, his voice low but steady. "If Nyklas's forces are this organized, it means he's close to his goal. Or worse," Hendrik added, "he's using this as a distraction." Albrecht placed a comforting hand on Hendrik's shoulder. "Whatever his intent, we must trust in Sigmar's light. This is not the time to falter." A sudden crash interrupted them as one of the windows shattered. An abomination forced its way inside, its grotesque form filling the small space. The villagers screamed, but Lucas moved quickly, driving his rapier into the creature's chest. Albrecht raised his hammer pendant, its light flaring brightly as the abomination writhed and crumbled into ash. "They'll keep coming," Lucas said. "We need to find the source of their strength." Nyklas's spies. As the battle raged outside, Hendrik noticed something strange among the villagers. A small group huddled in the corner, whispering to one another. They weren't frightened like the others. They were calm, too calm. One of them, a middle-aged man with a stern face, kept glancing toward the chapel doors, as if waiting for something. Hendrik approached cautiously. "You don't seem worried," he said, his tone probing. "Do you know something we don't?" The man's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing. "We're just keeping to ourselves," he said curtly. Hendrik wasn't convinced. "You're waiting for them, aren't you? You're working with Nyklas." The man's expression darkened, and before Hendrik could react, he lunged, a dagger glinting in his hand. Hendrik stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the blade, as Lucas appeared behind him. The witch hunter fired his pistol, the shot striking the man in the shoulder and sending him to the ground. "Spies," Lucas growled, kicking the dagger away. He glanced at the others in the group, who recoiled under his glare. "How many of you are working with him?" The wounded man sneered, blood trickling from his mouth. "You can't stop him," he rasped. "Nyklas is eternal. You're already too late." Lucas pressed the barrel of his pistol to the man's forehead. "I'll ask once more. How many?" The man laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "Enough." With a single motion, Lucas pulled the trigger, silencing him. The others in the group were quickly subdued, their betrayal clear. Hendrik felt a wave of nausea as he realized how deeply Nyklas's influence had penetrated. A Pyrrhic victory. By dawn, the undead horde had retreated, their numbers thinning as the rising sun pierced the mist. Dunkelwald was in ruins, its streets littered with the dead and its buildings smoldering from the fires of the battle. The villagers who had survived were battered and broken, their once quiet town reduced to a shadow of itself. Lucas stood in the square, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This was just the beginning," he said. "Nyklas is testing us, buying himself time. He'll come again, and next time, he'll bring his full strength." Albrecht knelt beside a fallen guard, his lips moving in silent prayer. Hendrik watched as the priest's shoulders sagged with exhaustion, the weight of their task pressing down on all of them. "We stopped him here," Hendrik said, his voice trembling with anger and resolve. "But we can't keep fighting like this. We have to strike at the source." Lucas turned to him, his expression hard. "Then we go to Castle Orlok." As they prepared to leave Dunkelwald, the people watched them with a mixture of hope and fear. The survivors knew the battle was far from over, and that their fate rested in the hands of 3 weary souls. Hendrik glanced back at the ruined town, his resolve hardening. Nyklas's reach had to end, and they were the only ones who could stop it. Chapter 17. The Baron's Secrets. The journey back to Wolfsbach was fraught with tension. The battered survivors of Dunkelwald weighed heavily on their minds, a stark reminder of Nyklas's growing reach. Hendrik, Lucas, and Father Albrecht knew they had little time to act. If they failed, Dunkelwald would be only the beginning. The three gathered in the Howling Hound's common room late that night, its flickering hearth providing the only light. Maps and parchment were spread across the table, their edges curling from the fire's warmth. Lucas stood with his arms crossed, his sharp gaze fixed on the crude sketch of Castle Orlok that lay before them. "We can't march through the front gates," Lucas said, his tone blunt. "Even if we had an army, Nyklas would see us coming long before we reached the walls." "Then we need another way in," Hendrik said. "A way he won't expect." "There is one," Father Albrecht said, his voice quiet but firm. "The catacombs." "Legends of the catacombs." Hendrik and Lucas turned to Albrecht, who leaned heavily on his staff, his face shadowed in the firelight. "The catacombs beneath Castle Orlok are older than the castle itself," the priest explained. "They were once part of an ancient crypt, a burial ground for a forgotten order of knights. When the von Carsteins took the castle, they claimed the catacombs as their own." Hendrik frowned. "If they're part of the castle, wouldn't Nyklas know about them?" "Oh, he knows," Albrecht replied. "But the catacombs are vast and dangerous even for him. The ancient wards placed there by the knights still linger, their power fading, but not extinguished. Nyklas may use parts of the catacombs, but there are areas he avoids, areas he cannot fully control." "That's where we'll go," Lucas said, his expression hard. "Through the places even Nyklas fears." "And what's waiting for us there?" Hendrik asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "Spirits, traps, and worse," Albrecht admitted. "But if we can navigate them, we'll find our way into the castle unnoticed." A hidden map. Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of the innkeeper, Otto, shuffling nervously into the room. He carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, his hands trembling as he placed it on the table. "I overheard you talking," Otto said, avoiding their gazes. "This might help." Lucas unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing an ancient map, its edges frayed and its ink faded with age. The layout of the catacombs was scrawled in meticulous detail, though parts of it were obscured by time and decay. Hendrik leaned forward, studying the map intently. "Where did you get this?" Lucas asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "It belonged to my grandfather," Otto said. "He was a gravedigger, back when the castle's crypts were still used by the living. He spoke of the catacombs, said they were cursed. But he kept this map, said it might be useful one day." Lucas nodded, his expression softening slightly. "It will be." Hendrik traced a path on the map with his finger. "This passage here," he said, pointing to a section marked with a faint X. "It leads directly beneath the castle." "Straight into the crypts," Albrecht said, his voice heavy with meaning. "The Soulstone will be close. Nyklas wouldn't let it stray far from his reach." The plan takes shape. Lucas tapped the map with his gloved hand. "We follow this route," he said. "Through the catacombs, into the crypts, into the Soulstone. Albrecht will carry the lantern of sanctity to keep the spirits at bay. Hendrik, you'll document everything. You're the only one who can decipher the symbols and wards we'll encounter." "And what about you?" Hendrik asked. "I'll keep us alive," Lucas said, his voice devoid of humor. Hendrik glanced at the map again, a knot forming in his stomach. "Even with the lantern, this is a dangerous gamble." "All of this is a gamble," Lucas replied sharply. "But it's the only chance we have. If we wait, Nyklas's power will grow beyond our ability to stop him." Hendrik nodded reluctantly. "Then we'll need to prepare." Preparations for the journey. The following day was spent gathering supplies. Albrecht blessed vials of holy water, their faint glow a reminder of Sigmar's protection. Lucas sharpened his weapons and ensured his pistol was loaded with silver-tipped bullets. Hendrik packed his satchel with maps, journals, and a small vial of ink, his tools as a scholar becoming his armor for the coming trials. The villagers watched them warily, their fear palpable. Whispers of their plans spread quickly, and while some offered quiet prayers, others averted their eyes, as if afraid to acknowledge the danger that surrounded them. That evening, as the sun set behind the jagged peaks of Sylvania, the trio stood at the edge of the forest. The path to the catacombs lay ahead, a narrow trail winding through dense trees and overgrown underbrush. "Once we enter," Lucas said, his voice low, "there's no turning back." Hendrik felt the weight of his satchel against his shoulder, and the chill of the lantern in his hand. "We're as ready as we'll ever be." Albrecht raised his hammer pendant, its faint light cutting through the gloom. "Then may Sigmar's light guide us." Together they stepped into the shadows, the path ahead shrouded in darkness. The catacombs awaited, a labyrinth of secrets and danger, and the only path to Nyklas von Carstein's undoing. Chapter 18. The First Assault. The entrance to the catacombs yawned like the mouth of a great beast, hidden beneath an overgrown thicket of vines and rubble. Hendrik hesitated as he stared into the dark passage, its cold breath brushing his face. Behind him, Lucas Dietrich adjusted his pistol, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings, while Father Albrecht whispered a prayer, the lantern of sanctity glowing faintly in his hand. "This is it," Lucas said grimly, motioning for the group to move forward. "Stay close. The lantern's light will keep the spirits at bay, but it won't save us from everything." Hendrik swallowed his apprehension and stepped into the darkness, the others close behind. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls slick with damp moss. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their muffled footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing from the depths. Entering the castle. The catacombs were a labyrinth of ancient stone corridors, their walls etched with faded runes and carvings. Hendrik paused occasionally to study the markings, scribbling notes into his journal. Each step brought them closer to Castle Orlok, the weight of its looming presence pressing down even from beneath its foundations. After what felt like hours of navigating the winding tunnels, they emerged into a small chamber. Above them, a spiral staircase wound its way upward, disappearing into the shadows. "This will take us into the castle," Albrecht whispered. "The crypts should be just beyond." Lucas nodded and led the way, his steps careful but swift. As they ascended, the oppressive silence was replaced by faint, echoing noises, the scrape of metal, distant whispers, and the hollow sound of footsteps. "We're not alone," Lucas said, his voice low. "Be ready." The ambush. They entered the crypts cautiously, the air thick with the stench of decay. Rows of stone sarcophagi lined the walls, their lids adorned with the effigies of long-dead nobles. The faint light of the lantern illuminated the chamber, casting eerie shadows across the vaulted ceiling. As they moved deeper, Hendrik noticed a faint, pulsating glow emanating from the far end of the crypt. It was a cold, unnatural light, and he felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine. "The Soulstone," Albrecht murmured, his eyes narrowing. "It must be near." Before they could move closer, a chilling voice echoed through the chamber. "So the hunters have come to play." The group spun around as a figure stepped from the shadows. Lady Irina, Nyklas's consort, was a vision of unnatural beauty, her pale skin luminescent in the lantern's glow. Her red lips curled into a cruel smile, and her eyes gleamed with malice. "You've strayed far from the light of Sigmar," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Did you think you could enter my lord's domain unchallenged?" Lucas raised his pistol. "Step aside, or I'll send you back to the grave." Irina laughed, a sound that sent chills through Hendrik. "You're bold, witch hunter. But this is my home, and you are nothing but prey." At her command, the sarcophagi lining the walls began to shift. The lids groaned as they slid open, and undead knights emerged, their rusted armor clanking as they drew their ancient weapons. Their empty eyes glowed faintly, and the air filled with the smell of rot and the faint whisper of unholy magic. The battle. The knights charged, their movements jerky but swift. Lucas fired his pistol, the silver-tipped bullet striking one knight square in the chest and sending it crashing to the ground. He drew his rapier and lunged at another, his blade slicing through its brittle armor with precision. Albrecht raised the lantern of sanctity, its holy light flaring brightly. The undead recoiled, their forms flickering as if caught between two worlds. The priest began chanting a prayer, his voice steady and resolute. Hendrik swung the lantern desperately, using its light to keep the knights at bay. His heart pounded as he narrowly avoided a sword strike, the blade slicing through the air just inches from his head. Irina watched the chaos with an amused smirk before stepping forward. "Enough of this," she said, raising a hand. Dark energy swirled around her fingers, and with a flick of her wrist, she sent a wave of necrotic magic hurtling toward them. The blast struck the group, sending them sprawling. Hendrik's lantern rolled from his grasp, its light dimming as it skittered across the floor. He scrambled to retrieve it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal as Irina advanced. "You're outmatched," she hissed, her eyes glowing with malice. "You cannot hope to defeat us." Lucas staggered to his feet, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. "We'll see about that." The discovery. Amid the chaos, Hendrik's eyes caught something beyond Irina, a faintly glowing pedestal tucked into a recess in the far wall. Atop it sat a jagged, black crystal pulsating with an eerie, otherworldly light. "The Soulstone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Albrecht followed his gaze and nodded. "We found it." "Good," Lucas said, slashing at another knight. "Now we get out of here before we're overrun." Albrecht grabbed the lantern and raised it high, its holy light blazing to life once more. The undead knights faltered, their movements slowing as the power of Sigmar pushed them back. Irina snarled, shielding her eyes from the light. "Fools!" she shrieked. "You will not escape." But the group was already retreating, their path illuminated by the lantern's glow. Hendrik glanced back once, locking eyes with Irina. Her face was twisted with rage, but there was something else in her gaze, a flicker of fear. A narrow escape. They fled back through the crypts, their footsteps echoing as the sounds of pursuit faded behind them. By the time they reached the catacombs, they were breathless and battered but alive. "We found it," Hendrik said, his voice shaking. "The Soulstone is real." "And now we know where it is," Lucas said. "But getting to it will be another matter." Albrecht nodded, his face pale but determined. "The Soulstone is protected by dark magic. We'll need more than faith and steel to destroy it." Hendrik looked back toward the crypt. The memory of Irina's piercing gaze burned into his mind. The Soulstone was within reach, but the cost of retrieving it, and the horrors they would face, was a weight none of them could ignore. "We'll be ready," Hendrik said, though his words felt hollow. "We have to be." As they emerged into the cold night air, the silhouette of Castle Orlok loomed above them, its jagged spires cutting into the starless sky. The first assault had failed, but the war was far from over. Chapter 19. Division in the Ranks. The small fire crackled in the clearing near the edge of the wirewood, casting long, flickering shadows on the forest floor. The trio had retreated far enough from Castle Orlok to avoid pursuit, but the tension between them was palpable. Exhaustion etched deep lines into their faces, and the weight of the failed assault pressed heavily on their shoulders. Lucas Dietrich sat apart from the others, his wide-brimmed hat resting on the ground beside him. He meticulously cleaned his pistol, each deliberate motion betraying the simmering frustration beneath his calm exterior. Father Albrecht knelt near the fire, murmuring prayers of thanks for their survival. Hendrik sat on a fallen log, staring into the flames, his thoughts churning with doubt. The silence stretched unbearably before Lucas spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "That was a disaster." "We made it out alive," Hendrik replied, not looking up. "That counts for something." "Alive?" "Yes," Lucas said sharply, "but empty-handed. The Soulstone is still in Nyklas's hands, and now he knows we're coming." "We confirmed its location," Hendrik argued. "That's not nothing." Lucas turned to him, his eyes hard. "You think knowledge will stop Nyklas? You think the Empire will care that you scribbled some notes in your journal when the undead march on Altdorf?" Hendrik's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to help. Maybe if you weren't so." "So what?" Lucas interrupted, rising to his feet. "So focused? So uncompromising? Someone has to be. You're so busy questioning everything that you can't see the simple truth. Nyklas is a monster, and the only way to stop him is to destroy him." Clashing beliefs. Father Albrecht stepped between them, his voice firm but calm. "Enough. We're on the same side." "Are we?" Lucas said, his gaze fixed on Hendrik. "He doesn't even believe in the mission. He's just a scholar, dabbling in matters far beyond his understanding." "That's not fair," Albrecht said. Hendrik has done his part. Without him, we wouldn't have even found the Soulstone. Without me, Lucas shot back, you'd both be dead. Hendrik stood abruptly, the tension boiling over. I never claimed to be a warrior, Lucas. I'm here because the church sent me. But maybe they were wrong. Maybe this isn't about faith. It's about survival. Faith is survival, Lucas snapped. Without Sigmar's light, we're nothing but prey for Nyklas and his kind. Hendrik's fists clenched at his sides. And what if Sigmar's light isn't enough? What if we need more than prayers and relics? What then, Lucas? Will you still cling to your doctrine while the world burns? The witch hunter's hand twitched toward his rapier, but he stopped himself, his expression a mask of cold anger. If you've lost your faith, that's your weakness. Don't make it mine. Hendrik's doubts. The confrontation ended as abruptly as it began, with Lucas stalking away to the edge of the clearing. Father Albrecht watched him go before turning to Hendrik, his weathered face filled with concern. You shouldn't antagonize him, Albrecht said softly. Lucas has his ways, but his heart is true. Hendrik sank back onto the log, running a hand through his hair. I'm not trying to antagonize him. I'm trying to make sense of all this. You're questioning your faith, Albrecht said, sitting beside him. Hendrik hesitated before nodding. How can I not? I've seen things in these last few days that defy everything I thought I understood. I've prayed, I've studied, but nothing I've learned has prepared me for this. Faith isn't about understanding, Albrecht said. It's about trust. Trust that Sigmar's light will guide us, even when the path is dark. That's easy for you to say, Hendrik replied. You've devoted your life to the church. But I'm just me. A scholar. I was sent here to observe, to document. I wasn't prepared for a war against the undead. None of us were prepared, Albrecht said, his voice tinged with sadness. But here we are, and we can either stand together or fall apart. Hendrik stared into the fire, its flickering light mirrored in his eyes. I don't know if I believe anymore, Albrecht. In Sigmar, in the church, in any of it. The priest placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder. Faith is not a constant, Hendrik. It ebbs and flows, like the tides. But even the smallest ember can ignite a fire. Don't let doubt consume you. A tenuous peace. The night passed in uneasy silence, the fire crackling softly as the trio rested. Hendrik tried to sleep, but his mind was restless, filled with visions of Nyklas, the Soulstone, and the horrors they had faced. When dawn broke, pale and gray, Lucas was already preparing to leave, his movements brisk and efficient. We move at first light, Lucas said curtly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Hendrik nodded, his earlier anger replaced by exhaustion. Father Albrecht stood between them, his calming presence a fragile bridge over the widening chasm of mistrust. As they gathered their supplies and prepared to re-enter the catacombs, Hendrik couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle wasn't just against Nyklas and his undead army. It was against the cracks forming in their fragile alliance, and the doubt threatening to consume his soul. Chapter 20. The Final Plan. The air in the small, dimly lit chamber beneath the howling hound was thick with tension. The trio had retreated here after their near-disastrous foray into Castle Orlok, their failures in fraying trust weighing heavily on them. The wooden table in the center of the room bore the crumpled map of the catacombs, alongside vials of holy water, blessed silver weapons, and the faintly glowing lantern of sanctity. Father Albrecht stood at the head of the table, his face shadowed and lined with exhaustion. He clutched his hammer pendant tightly, as though drawing strength from it. Lucas Dietrich leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed and his expression cold. Hendrik sat quietly, a quill in his hand, poised above his journal but unmoving. This is not just about reaching the Soulstone, Albrecht began, breaking the silence. It's about destroying it, and that will not be as simple as striking it with a weapon. Hendrik looked up, frowning. Why not? The hammer you gave us, the one blessed by Sigmar, should be enough. It won't be, Albrecht said, his voice heavy with certainty. The Soulstone is an artifact of immense power, a relic tied to the very origins of vampirism. It cannot be destroyed by brute force alone. To break its connection to the mortal world, We must purify it at a place where Sigmar's light still lingers. And where, exactly, do we find such a place? Lucas asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Castle Orlok isn't exactly known for its sanctity. There is one place, Albrecht said. The Crypt of Sigmar, hidden deep beneath the castle. The Crypt of Sigmar. The Crypt of Sigmar? Hendrik repeated, flipping through his notes. I've never heard of it. Few have, Albrecht replied. It predates even the founding of Castle Orlok. Long before the von Carsteins claimed this land, a small order of Sigmarite knights established a shrine here. They believed this place was a site of great spiritual significance, blessed by Sigmar himself. And what happened to them? Lucas asked. They were slaughtered when the von Carsteins rose to power, Albrecht said grimly. But their crypts remain. The legends say their final resting place is still protected by the blessings of Sigmar, untouched by the darkness that now surrounds it. Hendrik leaned forward. If the crypt is so well protected, how can we access it? That, Albrecht admitted, will be the greatest challenge. The crypt lies beneath the deepest levels of Castle Orlok, beyond even the catacombs. It is said to be hidden behind wards and ancient seals, guarded by both the spirits of the knights and whatever horrors Nyklas has placed in our path. Wonderful, Lucas muttered. So we fight through undead knights, break ancient seals, and hope the crypt is still intact. Anything else? Yes, Albrecht said solemnly. We must perform the rite of purification. The rite of purification. The rite is a sacred ritual, Albrecht explained. It requires the recitation of specific prayers, the anointing of the soulstone with holy water, and the use of the lantern of sanctity to focus Sigmar's light upon it. Only then can the soulstone's power be severed. And who performs this ritual? Hendrik asked, his voice tinged with unease. I will, Albrecht said. As a priest of Sigmar, it is my duty. But the rite will take time, and I cannot complete it alone. You must protect me while I perform it. Hendrik exchanged a worried glance with Lucas. How long are we talking? Minutes, Albrecht replied. But against Nyklas and his forces, even seconds will feel like an eternity. Lucas straightened, his expression hardening. If that's what it takes, then we'll make it happen. But we need a solid plan, no improvisation. The plan takes shape. The trio pored over the map of the catacombs, tracing the route they would need to take. Hendrik pointed to a section marked with faded runes. This passage here, it should lead us close to the crypt. But these markings suggest traps, or possibly magical wards. We'll use the lantern to dispel the wards, Albrecht said. But we'll need to be cautious. The closer we get to the crypt, the more resistance we'll face. And once we're inside, Lucas asked. We secure the area and begin the rite, Albrecht said. The crypt's blessing should weaken Nyklas's forces, but he will come for us. We must hold the line until the ritual is complete. Hendrik frowned. And what about the soulstone itself? What happens when it's destroyed? Albrecht hesitated, his eyes darkening. The soulstone's destruction will release a surge of energy. It will break Nyklas's hold over the land, but it will also unleash chaos. We must be prepared for the consequences. Great, Lucas said dryly. So we might not survive, even if we succeed. Albrecht nodded. Sigmar's work is not without sacrifice. Tensions resurface. As they finalized the plan, the lingering tension between Hendrik and Lucas flared again. This is madness, Hendrik said, shaking his head. We're betting everything on a legend, a crypt that might not even exist. And what's your alternative? Lucas snapped. Sit here and wait for Nyklas to march on the Empire. I'm saying we need to be smarter, Hendrik retorted. Charging headfirst into the lion's den isn't bravery, it's suicide. It's duty, Lucas said coldly. Something you clearly don't understand. Enough, Albrecht interjected, his voice firm. We don't have time for this. Nyklas's power grows stronger with every moment we delay. If we don't act now, there won't be a chance later. The room fell silent, the crackling fire the only sound. Hendrik exhaled slowly, his frustration giving way to resignation. Fine, he said. Let's do this. A final resolve. As the first light of dawn broke over the jagged peaks of Sylvania, the trio prepared to set out for Castle Orlok. The plan was dangerous, their chances slim, but their resolve was unshakable. They would infiltrate the castle, find the Crypt of Sigmar, and destroy the Soulstone, no matter the cost. Standing at the edge of the forest, Hendrik glanced back at the village of Wolfsbach, its crumbling buildings bathed in pale light. The people there placed their hope in them. And for the first time, Hendrik felt the weight of that hope pressing on his shoulders. "Sigmar willing," Albrecht said, holding the lantern high, "we will see this through." "And if he's not willing?" Hendrik muttered. Lucas adjusted his hat and drew his rapier. "Then we make him proud." With that, they stepped into the shadow of Castle Orlok, the final leg of their journey beginning beneath the watchful gaze of its jagged spires. Chapter 21. The Siege of Castle Orlok. The storm clouds that hung over Castle Orlok were thick and menacing, blotting out the moon and stars. Lightning burst across the jagged spires of the fortress, illuminating the crumbling walls and casting fleeting shadows over the horde of undead that surrounded the castle. The moaning of the risen dead filled the night air, a chilling cacophony of despair and menace. At the edge of the Wordwood, Hendrik, Lucas Dietrich, and Father Albrecht stood with the surviving villagers from Dunkelwald and Wolfsbach, armed with pitchforks, axes, and makeshift shields. The odds were grim, but desperation had forged the group into a determined force. "This is madness," Hendrik muttered, gripping the hilt of a borrowed sword. His usual satchel of books and notes hung at his side, but tonight it felt like a burden rather than a lifeline. "It's the only way," Lucas said, his voice cold and steady. His pistol gleamed faintly in the flickering light of the lantern. "We draw Nyklas's forces to the walls and force his hand. While they're focused on us, we slip into the crypts and destroy the Soulstone." Father Albrecht raised the lantern of sanctity, its blessed light cutting through the darkness. "Sigmar's light will guide us," he said firmly, though the weariness in his voice betrayed his doubt. Hendrik cast a wary glance at the villagers. Most of them were farmers and tradesmen, untrained for battle but resolved to fight for their homes and families. Their faces were pale with fear, but their eyes burned with determination. "Let's get this over with," Hendrik said, steeling himself for what was to come. The first wave of the assault was a chaotic charge across the open field toward the castle gates. The villagers shouted battle cries, their voices trembling but fierce, as they advanced with torches and weapons held high. Lucas led the charge, his rapier flashing as he felled the first zombie that shambled toward them. Hendrik stayed close behind, swinging his sword awkwardly, but managing to keep the undead at bay. The undead forces responded swiftly. Skeletons armed with rusted swords and shields emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes glowing with malevolent light. Abominations, stitched together horrors of flesh and bone, roared as they charged, their misshapen limbs swinging wildly. Father Albrecht stood at the rear of the group, chanting prayers as the lantern's light flared brightly. The holy glow burned through the undead ranks, causing them to falter and crumble. The villagers rallied around the light, their courage bolstered as they pressed forward. "Hold the line," Lucas shouted, cutting down another skeleton. "We can't let them overwhelm us." Despite their initial success, the horde's sheer numbers began to take their toll. For every undead creature they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The villagers fought valiantly, but the weight of the enemy's relentless assault was overwhelming. "We're not going to hold much longer," Hendrik shouted, his voice hoarse. "We don't need to," Lucas replied. "Albrecht, light the way." The priest nodded and raised the lantern high. Its golden light surged outward, creating a brief reprieve as the undead recoiled from the divine radiance. "This way," Lucas called, leading Hendrik and a small group of villagers toward a hidden passage near the castle's base. The rest of the villagers, led by a grizzled farmer named Jorgen, remained behind to hold the line. "Don't let them through," Jorgen roared, brandishing an axe as he stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. "For Dunkelwald, for Sigmar." Hendrik glanced back as they ran, guilt gnawing at him for leaving the villagers to face the brunt of the horde. But he knew their sacrifice was necessary. If they didn't succeed in destroying the Soulstone, none of this would matter. The hidden passage led them into the castle's lower levels, where the air was thick with mildew and the faint stench of death. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stone corridor. "Stay alert," Lucas said, his voice a low whisper. "Nyklas will have more than undead waiting for us." As they approached the entrance to the crypts, they encountered their first obstacle, a pair of undead knights clad in rusted armor, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. The knights raised their swords in unison and charged, their movements unnervingly fast. Lucas met them head-on, his rapier darting between the joints in their armor. Hendrik and one of the villagers, a blacksmith named Karl, flanked the second knight. Hendrik's swing glanced off the knight's shield, but Karl's hammer struck true, shattering the creature's helmet and sending it crashing to the ground. "We're close," Albrecht said, his voice tight with urgency. "The Soulstone's presence is stronger here." As they descended deeper into the crypts, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, and the wall seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The faint glow of the Soulstone could be seen in the distance, its eerie light casting long shadows. But before they could reach it, the air grew cold, and a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. "You truly are persistent." Nyklas von Carstein stepped from the shadows, his form elegant yet menacing. His crimson cloak billowed behind him, and his pale, sharp features were illuminated by the Soulstone's glow. Beside him stood Lady Irina, her beauty as chilling as it was otherworldly. "You should have fled while you had the chance," Nyklas said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Now you've brought death upon yourselves." Lucas stepped forward, his rapier raised. "We're not here to negotiate, vampire. This ends tonight." Nyklas smiled, his fangs glinting in the dim light. "Indeed it does." With a flick of his wrist, Nyklas summoned more undead knights, their heavy footfalls echoing in the crypt. Irina's eyes glowed as she unleashed a wave of dark magic, forcing the group to scatter. "Go for the Soulstone?" Lucas shouted. "I'll hold them off." Hendrik hesitated, torn between helping Lucas and following his orders. Albrecht grabbed his arm, his expression resolute. "We must trust him. Come." They pushed forward, weaving through the chaos as Lucas and the villagers engaged Nyklas and his minions. The Soulstone pulsed with energy, its light growing brighter as they approached. "Sigmar, guide us," Albrecht whispered, raising the lantern. Its light pierced the darkness, clearing a path to the pedestal. Hendrik reached the Soulstone first, its cold, unnatural energy coursing through him as he placed his hands on it. The artifact seemed to resist him, its power surging in defiance. "Do it," Albrecht shouted, holding the lantern high. Hendrik gritted his teeth and nodded. "For Sigmar. For all of us." Chapter 22. Descent into Darkness. The air in the catacombs of Castle Orlok was colder than the deepest winter night, carrying the faint stench of rot and decay. The flickering light of the lantern of sanctity barely pushed back the oppressive darkness, and every step felt like a descent into another layer of torment. Hendrik clutched the lantern tightly, his breath shallow as he scanned the stone walls for signs of traps or danger. "Stay close," Lucas Dietrich whispered, his rapier glinting faintly in the lantern's glow. His eyes darted between the shadows, his movements tense but deliberate. Father Albrecht walked beside him, murmuring prayers under his breath as his hammer pendant swayed with each step. The group pressed forward, the silence broken only by the faint drip of water from the ceiling and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the distance. The first trap revealed itself in a flash of movement. Hendrik barely had time to shout a warning as a series of razor-sharp blades sprung from the walls, slicing through the air in deadly arcs. Lucas shoved Hendrik back, narrowly avoiding the spinning blades as they retracted into the walls. "They're not just protecting the Soulstone," Lucas growled. "They're protecting everything Nyklas doesn't want seen." Hendrik knelt to examine the mechanism, his hands shaking. The trap was ancient but well-maintained, its gears oiled and sharp edges gleaming. "These weren't made by Nyklas," he said. "This is older, far older." Albrecht nodded solemnly. "The knights who built these catacombs knew what would come. They prepared as best they could. Then we better be just as prepared, Lucas said. Keep moving. The traps grew more insidious as they delved deeper. Spiked pits yawned beneath their feet, hidden by rotted planks. Jets of green flame burst from hidden alcoves, scorching the stone walls. Hendrik's heart pounded as he disarmed a pressure plate, his sweat-soaked fingers fumbling with the ancient mechanism. "This is madness," he muttered. "Every step we take feels like a step closer to death." The traps gave way to a new horror as the group entered a vast chamber. Torches burned dimly along the walls, illuminating grotesque sights that froze Hendrik in his tracks. Metal tables lined the room, each one occupied by a figure that could barely be called human. Bodies stitched together from various parts lay strapped to the slabs, their lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Some twitched as if trying to move, while others let out faint, guttural moans. Jars filled with murky liquid lined the walls, containing disembodied limbs, organs, and grotesque fetuses suspended in preservation. "Sigmar preserve us," Albrecht whispered, clutching his pendant tightly. "What manner of blasphemy is this?" "Nyklas's experiments," Lucas said grimly. "He's not just raising the dead, he's creating them." Hendrik felt bile rise in his throat as he approached one of the tables. The creature strapped to it was a monstrous amalgamation of human and animal parts, its flesh sewn together with black thread. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and its eyes followed Hendrik's movements, filled with a pain that was almost human. "This is beyond necromancy," Hendrik said, his voice trembling. "This is something else. Something worse." "He's building an army," Lucas said, his tone sharp. "These things aren't just for show. They're weapons." A low growl echoed through the chamber, and the group turned as one. From the far end of the room, a massive figure emerged, its twisted form illuminated by the flickering torches. It was one of Nyklas's creations, a hulking monstrosity with claws as long as swords and a head that resembled a wolf's skull, fused with a human face. "It's guarding the way forward," Lucas said, stepping in front of the group. "Get ready." The creature lunged, its claws tearing through the air with terrifying speed. Lucas met it head-on, his rapier darting between its ribs, but the beast barely flinched. It swiped at him, forcing him to roll aside as its claws gouged deep marks into the stone floor. Albrecht raised the lantern of sanctity, its light flaring brightly. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural snarl as its flesh sizzled under the holy glow. Hendrik scrambled to find a weapon, his hands trembling as he grabbed a discarded torch. "Keep it back," Lucas shouted, slashing at the beast's legs. Albrecht used the lantern. "I'm trying," the priest replied, his voice strained as he struggled to hold the light steady. The beast roared and lunged at Albrecht, but Hendrik stepped forward, thrusting the burning torch into its face. The creature howled, retreating momentarily as flames licked at its malformed flesh. Lucas seized the opportunity, driving his rapier into the creature's chest with all his strength. The blade pierced its heart, and with a final, deafening scream, the monstrosity collapsed in a heap, its body twitching before going still. As they caught their breath, Hendrik turned back to the rows of experiments. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the grotesque creations, each one a testament to Nyklas's depravity. "This is what he does," Hendrik said quietly. "He takes life and twists it into something unrecognizable. How can we fight against this?" "We fight because we must," Lucas said, cleaning his blade. "Because if we don't, no one else will." Albrecht placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder. "These horrors are meant to break your spirit, to make you lose hope. But we cannot falter. The Soulstone is close. I can feel its power." Hendrik nodded, though the weight of what he had seen pressed heavily on him. "Let's keep moving." The way forward. They exited the chamber and descended deeper into the catacombs, the air growing colder with each step. The faint glow of the Soulstone's power could be seen in the distance, a pulsing light that seemed to draw them forward and repel them at the same time. "We're almost there," Albrecht said, his voice filled with both determination and dread. "But the worst is yet to come." Hendrik tightened his grip on the lantern, his resolve hardening. The horrors they had witnessed would haunt him forever. But he knew there was no turning back. Nyklas's evil had to be stopped, no matter the cost. As they moved closer to their goal, the oppressive darkness of the catacombs seemed to press in around them, whispering of despair and death. But within Hendrik, a small ember of hope remained, flickering stubbornly against the void. Chapter 23. The Soulstone Revealed. The catacombs seemed to stretch endlessly, the oppressive darkness broken only by the faint golden glow of the Lantern of Sanctity. The faint hum of dark energy had grown louder as the group ventured deeper, resonating through the walls and filling the air with a nauseating tension. Each step felt heavier, as though the very stones beneath their feet resisted their progress. "This is it," Father Albrecht whispered, his voice taut with both awe and dread. "The Soulstone is near." Hendrik clutched the lantern tightly, its blessed light flickering in his trembling hands. The air had grown colder, biting into his skin even through his heavy cloak. Beside him, Lucas Dietrich moved with grim determination, his rapier glinting faintly in the lantern's glow. The faint sound of whispers echoed the corridor, unintelligible but insistent, as though the catacombs themselves were alive with malevolent intent. Ahead, a massive stone door loomed in the darkness, its surface engraved with intricate runes that pulsed faintly with crimson light. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe as though imbued with a dark will of their own. "This must be it," Hendrik said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stepped forward, examining the door. Nyklas wouldn't leave this unguarded. "Be ready." The runes on the door flared brightly as Albrecht raised the lantern, its holy light pushing against the crimson glow. With a groaning sound, the door began to slide open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The room was immense, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness. At the center stood a raised dais, carved from black stone and surrounded by jagged spires. Atop the dais rested the Soulstone of Lahmia, its jagged surface glowing with an unholy light. The artifact pulsed rhythmically, like the beat of a monstrous heart, and with each pulse the air seemed to shudder. Hendrik felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he stepped into the chamber. The Soulstone's energy was palpable, pressing against his chest and filling his mind with whispers of despair and temptation. This is it," he murmured, his voice trembling. "The source of Nyklas's power." The Soulstone was larger than he had imagined, a jagged shard of black crystal veined with crimson. Its glow bathed the chamber in a sickly light, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "It's worse than I feared," Albrecht said, his face pale. "This is no mere relic. It is a gateway, a conduit for the darkest magics imaginable." Lucas gripped his rapier tightly, his jaw set. "Then we destroy it, quickly before." A low rumble interrupted him, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The air grew colder, and the whispers that had been faint now rose to a deafening cacophony. From the shadows surrounding the dais, figures began to emerge. At first they appeared human, but as they stepped into the Soulstone's crimson light, their true forms became clear. These were no ordinary undead. Their decayed bodies were clad in ancient, rusted armor, their hollow eyes burning with malevolent energy. Each carried a massive weapon, greatswords, axes, and maces, that glowed faintly with the same crimson light as the Soulstone. "Guardians," Albrecht said, his voice grim. "Nyklas has bound them to the Soulstone. They will defend it to the death, and beyond." The Guardians advanced slowly, their movements deliberate and unrelenting. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay, and the whispers in the chamber grew louder, their words now clear. "Leave. Flee. Despair." Lucas stepped forward, his pistol aimed at the nearest Guardian. "Get ready. This won't be easy." The first Guardian charged, its greatsword swinging in a wide arc. Lucas dodged to the side, his rapier flashing as he struck the creature's exposed joints. The blade bit into the decayed flesh, but the Guardian didn't falter, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Hendrik raised the lantern, its holy light flaring brightly. The guardians recoiled, their movements slowing as the divine energy pushed against them. "Keep the light steady," Albrecht shouted, raising his hammer pendant. "Sigmar's power is our only hope." The priest's prayers echoed through the chamber, the holy words cutting through the whispers. A wave of golden light surged outward, burning away the dark energy that animated the nearest guardian. It let out a guttural roar before collapsing into a heap of rusted armor and ash. But the remaining guardians pressed on, their movements growing faster and more coordinated. One lunged at Hendrik, its mace swinging down with terrifying force. He stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the blow as the lantern wavered in his grasp. "Focus," Lucas barked, driving his rapier into another guardian's chest. The blade pierced its armor, but the creature grabbed him with its skeletal hand, lifting him off the ground. Albrecht rushed forward, his hammer pendant glowing brightly. With a shout, he struck the guardian, the holy energy coursing through his weapon, shattering the creature's arm. Lucas dropped to the ground, coughing but unharmed. As the battle raged, the Soulstone's glow intensified. The whispers grew louder, filling Hendrik's mind with images of despair and futility. He saw visions of the villagers he had left behind, their faces twisted in agony as Nyklas's forces overwhelmed them. He saw himself falling to the undead, his body rising as a thrall to serve Nyklas for eternity. "Don't listen to it," Albrecht shouted, his voice cutting through the illusions. "The Soulstone preys on your fear. Trust in the light." Hendrik gritted his teeth and raised the lantern higher, its glow pushing back the shadows and silencing the whispers. He locked eyes with the Soulstone, its pulsating light almost hypnotic. "We have to end this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "Now." Albrecht nodded, raising his hammer pendant once more. "To destroy it, we must complete the rite of purification. But first, we must secure the chamber." Lucas dispatched the last guardian with a swift strike, its armor clattering to the ground as it disintegrated. The chamber fell silent, save for the hum of the Soulstone and the labored breathing of the group. The three stood before the daze, the Soulstone's light casting eerie shadows across their faces. Hendrik felt a wave of nausea as he stared at the artifact, its power radiating like a living presence. "This is it," Albrecht said, his voice trembling but resolute. "The final step. We destroy the Soulstone, and Nyklas's power crumbles." "And if we fail?" Hendrik asked. "We don't fail," Lucas said firmly, his rapier still dripping with dark ichor. "We can't." Hendrik took a deep breath and nodded. The weight of their task pressed heavily on him, but for the first time he felt a spark of determination. The Soulstone was the source of Nyklas's power, the heart of his darkness, and it would end here, no matter the cost. Chapter 24. Nyklas's True Form. The oppressive silence in the Soulstone's chamber shattered like glass as the stone's pulsating hum deepened into a deafening roar. The crimson light intensified, casting jagged shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe like living things. The air turned icy, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. From the far end of the chamber, a chilling voice echoed through the darkness. "You've come far, but you've made a grave mistake." Nyklas von Carstein stepped into the light of the Lantern of Sanctity, his once polished and refined appearance replaced by something far more sinister. His crimson cloak billowed behind him like a pool of blood, and his pale skin glowed faintly in the Soulstone's light. His sharp features were now grotesquely exaggerated, his fangs gleaming like daggers. His eyes burned with a hellish red light, filled with malice and hunger. "You think you can destroy what I have built?" Nyklas snarled, his voice no longer human. It was guttural, layered with the voices of countless souls trapped by his magic. "You are nothing but insects before the might of the von Carsteins." As the group steadied themselves, Nyklas stepped forward, his form shifting and expanding. His limbs elongated unnaturally, his hands transforming into clawed talons. His cloak seemed to merge with his body, forming leathery wings that unfurled with a menacing hiss. His face contorted, his mouth widening into a fanged maw, and his entire body pulsed with the same dark energy as the Soulstone. Nyklas's voice became a growl, reverberating through the chamber. "This is my domain. You cannot stand against me." Hendrik clutched the lantern tightly, its golden light flickering in the face of Nyklas's overwhelming presence. What is he?" he stammered. "A true vampire lord," Father Albrecht said, his voice heavy with dread. "Nyklas has shed his human facade. This is his true form." Nyklas spread his wings, his monstrous form towering over them. "You should feel honored. Few lived long enough to see my power in its entirety." Nyklas raised a clawed hand, and the soulstone flared brightly. The walls of the chamber groaned as undead guardians burst forth from hidden alcoves, their weapons glowing with crimson energy. The moaning of the risen dead filled the air as they surrounded the group. "Hold the line," Lucas shouted, his rapier flashing as he cut down the first guardian to reach them. "Don't let him divide us." The group fought desperately, their weapons striking against the seemingly endless tide of undead. Albrecht held the lantern of sanctity high, its holy light burning away the dark energy animating the lesser undead. But even its power seemed to falter in the presence of the soulstone. Nyklas watched with a cruel smile, his wings spreading as he hovered above the battle. "Is this all you have?" he mocked. "You cannot hope to stop me." With a sweep of his claw, Nyklas unleashed a wave of necrotic energy. It struck the ground with a deafening crash, sending Hendrik and Albrecht sprawling. The light of the lantern dimmed, and the undead pressed their advantage. Hendrik scrambled to his feet, gripping the lantern tightly. He swung it at an advancing guardian, the holy light searing through its decayed flesh. "We can't hold them off forever," he shouted. "We don't need forever," Lucas replied, firing his pistol a skeletal knight. "Just long enough to destroy the soulstone." Nyklas landed with a thunderous crash, his claws raking across the ground. He charged at Lucas, his monstrous speed catching the witch hunter off guard. Lucas raised his rapier just in time to deflect a claw swipe, but the force of the blow sent him flying into a nearby pillar. "You are weak," Nyklas sneered, advancing on Lucas, a pitiful shadow of the Empire's once great defenders. Albrecht intervened, stepping between Nyklas and Lucas. The priest raised his hammer pendant, its golden glow flaring brightly. "Sigmar's light will strike you down, fiend," he declared. Nyklas snarled, shielding his eyes from the holy light. With a roar, he lashed out with his wings, knocking Albrecht to the ground. The pendant clattered across the floor, its light dimming. Hendrik stared in horror as Nyklas approached the dais. The soulstone pulsed with renewed energy, and the whispers in the chamber grew deafening. "You see," Nyklas said, turning to face them, "this is power, true power. You cannot destroy me, for I am eternal." With a wave of his hand, the soulstone's energy surged, and the undead seemed to grow stronger. Their movements became faster, their attacks more coordinated. Hendrik barely managed to avoid a blow from a skeletal knight, his heart pounding as he swung the lantern wildly. "We have to stop him," Hendrik shouted. "We have to destroy the soulstone now." Lucas struggled to his feet, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. "Albrecht, can you perform the rite?" The priest groaned as he pushed himself up, his hand reaching for the fallen pendant. I can try, but I'll need time." "Then we'll buy you time," Lucas said, his voice firm. He turned to Hendrik. "Keep the lantern on him. The light weakens his power." Hendrik stepped forward, the lantern of sanctity raised high. Its golden light flared brightly, pushing back the crimson glow of the soulstone. Nyklas snarled, shielding his face with a wing as the holy energy seared his monstrous form. "You think this will stop me?" Nyklas roared. "You are nothing but insects before my power." "Maybe," Hendrik said, his voice trembling but steady. "But even the smallest light can pierce the darkness." Nyklas lunged at him, his claws slashing through the air. Hendrik dodged, the lantern's light flickering as he stumbled backward. Lucas and Albrecht rushed to his aid, their combined efforts forcing Nyklas to retreat momentarily. As the battle raged on, Albrecht knelt before the soulstone, the hammer pendant clutched tightly in his hands. He began chanting the rite of purification, his voice rising above the cacophony of whispers and battle cries. Nyklas turned, his eyes blazing with fury. "No," he bellowed, "you will not take this from me. He charged at Albrecht, but Lucas intercepted him, his rapier slashing at the vampire lord's wings. Hendrik swung the lantern, its light flaring as it struck Nyklas's side. The vampire roared in pain, his movements slowing under the holy assault. "Keep him back!" Albrecht shouted, his voice unwavering as the ritual reached its crescendo. The soulstone began to tremble, its light flickering erratically. The whispers grew frantic, their tone shifting from temptation to fear. Nyklas's monstrous form seemed to falter, his confidence replaced by desperation. "You cannot stop me," Nyklas roared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I am eternal." Hendrik and Lucas stood their ground, their weapons raised as the light of the lantern of sanctity burned brighter. Together, they pushed Nyklas back, their resolve unyielding. The battle was far from over, but for the first time they glimpsed the possibility of victory. Chapter 25. The Priest's Sacrifice. The chamber shook violently, the unholy energy of the soulstone pulsing erratically as Father Albrecht knelt before it, his voice rising in fervent prayer. The golden light of the lantern of sanctity flickered with desperation, its holy radiance warring against the crimson glow of the cursed artifact. The air crackled with tension as the whispers of the soulstone became a roar, echoing its resistance. Nyklas von Carstein stood at the edge of the dais, his monstrous form towering over the priest. His clawed hands twitched with rage, his fanged maw twisting into a snarl as he advanced. "You think your pitiful prayers can undo my power?" he growled, his voice layered with the voices of the countless souls bound to him. "You will die like all the others." Hendrik and Lucas moved to intercept him, their weapons raised. "Stay back," Lucas shouted, his rapier gleaming in the lantern's glow. "You'll face us first." Nyklas barely spared them a glance. "You are nothing but gnats." With a sweep of his arm, he unleashed a wave of necrotic energy, sending the pair sprawling across the stone floor. "Your priest will die by my hand." Albrecht clutched his hammer pendant tightly, his hands trembling not with fear, but with the strain of channeling Sigmar's light into the corrupted crypt. "Sigmar, hear my prayer," he intoned, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Let your light cleanse this unholy place. Let your wrath strike down this darkness." The soulstone pulsed again, its light dimming slightly as if recoiling from the power of the prayer. Nyklas hesitated, his fiery eyes narrowing as he sensed the shift. "You cannot win," Nyklas said, his tone laced with anger and desperation. "This place is mine. My power is absolute." But Albrecht stood firm, his voice rising. "Your power is a shadow, a mockery of life. Sigmar's light will pierce it, as the sun pierces the night." As Nyklas lunged toward Albrecht, Lucas intercepted him, his rapier striking against the vampire's clawed hand. The blow deflected Nyklas's attack, but left Lucas vulnerable. Nyklas retaliated with a brutal swipe, sending the witch hunter crashing into a pillar. Hendrik rushed forward, swinging the lantern toward Nyklas. Its holy light flared brightly, forcing the vampire lord to retreat momentarily. "You won't touch him," Hendrik shouted, his voice trembling but resolute. Nyklas snarled, his wings spreading wide as he unleashed another wave of necrotic energy. The ground beneath them cracked, and the undead guardians in the chamber began to stir, their shattered forms reanimating under the influence of the soulstone. Albrecht's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough," he bellowed, his tone filled with righteous fury. He rose to his feet, his hammer pendant glowing with a brilliance that rivaled the lantern. "I will end this. Say." Albrecht turned to Hendrik and Lucas, his eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "You must finish this," he said. "Destroy the soulstone. Stop Nyklas. But to do so, this place must be sanctified. The darkness must be purged." Hendrik's heart sank as he realized what Albrecht was saying. "No, there must be another way." "There isn't," Albrecht said firmly. "This place is steeped in corruption. To cleanse it, a sacrifice must be made. My soul will anchor Sigmar's light here, allowing you to finish what we started." "Albrecht, no," Lucas shouted, staggering to his feet. "We need you." "You need the light," Albrecht replied. "And this is the only way." Nyklas roared, surging toward the dais. "You will not take this from me." Albrecht raised the pendant high, its golden light surging outward with a force that stopped Nyklas in his tracks. The vampire screamed in pain as the holy energy burned his monstrous form, forcing him to retreat. Turning back to the Soulstone, Albrecht pressed the pendant against its jagged surface. The artifact pulsed violently, the crimson light flaring as it fought against the divine power. "Sigmar, guide me," Albrecht whispered. "Let your light cleanse this place. Let your servant be your instrument." With a final, deafening roar, the light from the pendant erupted, engulfing the chamber. The crimson glow of the Soulstone faltered, dimming as the holy energy poured into it. Albrecht's body shone with divine radiance, his form dissolving into pure light as he became one with the sanctity of the crypt. As the light faded, the chamber fell silent. The undead guardians crumbled into dust, their connection to the Soulstone severed. Nyklas staggered, his monstrous form weakened and flickering as though barely held together. Hendrik fell to his knees, the lantern still clutched in his hands. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the spot where Albrecht had stood moments before. "He's gone." Lucas placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder, his face grim but resolute. He did what he had to. "And now, it's up to us to finish this." The Soulstone's light was dim but still pulsing faintly, its power greatly diminished but not yet destroyed. Nyklas growled, his fiery eyes locking onto the artifact. "No," the vampire roared. "It is mine. You will not take it." Hendrik rose shakily to his feet, his grip on the lantern tightening. "We're not taking it," he said, his voice steady despite the tears. "We're destroying it." As Nyklas lunged toward them, his weakened form still radiating fury, Hendrik and Lucas prepared for their final stand. The Soulstone was vulnerable, and the time to end Nyklas's reign of terror had come. Chapter 26. The Count's Fall. The chamber trembled violently, the residual light of Father Albrecht's sacrifice still lingering in the air. The once overwhelming crimson glow of the Soulstone had dimmed to a faint, erratic pulse, its power waning, but not yet extinguished. Nyklas von Carstein, weakened and enraged, staggered toward the dais, his monstrous form flickering like a failing shadow. His fiery red eyes burned with desperation and hatred. "You dare defy me?" Nyklas roared, his voice layered with the echoes of countless enslaved souls. "I am eternal. I am von Carstein." Hendrik stood beside the dais, clutching the lantern of sanctity tightly, its golden glow now steady and resolute. Lucas Dietrich, bloodied and battered, steadied himself with his rapier, his cold gaze fixed on the vampire lord. Together, they faced the dark creature who had brought so much death and despair to Sylvania. "No," Lucas said, his voice sharp and unwavering. "You're just another monster waiting to be slain." Nyklas lunged with terrifying speed, his claws slicing through the air. Lucas moved to intercept him, his rapier flashing as he struck at Nyklas's exposed chest. The blade pierced flesh and bone, but Nyklas barely flinched, his monstrous strength undiminished by pain. "You are nothing, witch hunter," Nyklas snarled, his claws slashing toward Lucas. "Your faith cannot save you." Lucas dodged narrowly, the claws grazing his shoulder and tearing through his coat. He countered with a precise thrust, aiming for Nyklas's heart. The blade struck true, but Nyklas roared in defiance, grabbing the weapon and snapping it in half with his claws. Hendrik watched in horror as Nyklas grabbed Lucas by the throat, lifting him into the air. The vampire's wings unfurled, and his twisted, skeletal face twisted into a wicked grin. "Your blood will fuel my power," Nyklas growled, his fangs bared, "and your soul will be bound to me for eternity." "Not today," Lucas choked, reaching into his coat. With a swift motion, he drew a silver dagger and plunged it into Nyklas's side. The vampire howled in agony, dropping Lucas as the holy metal burned through his flesh. Nyklas stumbled back, clutching his side as smoke rose from the wound. Hendrik rushed to Lucas's side, helping the witch hunter to his feet. "We can't keep this up," Hendrik said, his voice trembling. "He's too strong." "We don't need to," Lucas replied, his eyes narrowing. "Destroy the Soulstone. Now." Hendrik hesitated, staring at the artifact on the dais. Its faint glow pulsed weakly, as if clinging to its last remnants of power. The whispers that had once filled the chamber were now faint and incoherent, their strength sapped by Albrecht's sacrifice. "If I destroy it," Hendrik began, his voice faltering. "The crypt will collapse," Lucas said. "But so will Nyklas's power. It's the only way." Hendrik nodded, his resolve hardening. He turned toward the Soulstone, the lantern's glow intensifying as he raised it above the cursed relic. Nyklas roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the crypt. "You will not take what is mine." His wings spread wide as he charged toward the dais, his claws outstretched. Lucas stepped forward, blocking Nyklas's path. "Over my dead body," he said, his voice cold and determined. Nyklas snarled and lunged, his claws slashing toward Lucas with deadly precision. But the witch hunter was ready. He ducked under the blow and, with one swift motion, grabbed the hilt of the silver dagger still embedded in Nyklas's side. With a grunt of effort, Lucas ripped the dagger free and drove it upward, straight into Nyklas's throat. The vampire lord let out a guttural scream, his movements faltering as blood poured from the wound. Lucas didn't stop. Drawing on every ounce of strength he had left, he swung the broken blade of his rapier, its jagged edge slicing clean through Nyklas's neck. For a moment the chamber fell silent as Nyklas's severed head hit the ground. His body collapsed in a heap, his monstrous form disintegrating into ash as the Soulstone's power began to fade. Hendrik stood before the Soulstone, the lantern raised high. The whispers had fallen silent, replaced by an almost deafening stillness. He hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Hendrik," Lucas shouted, "do it now." Taking a deep breath, Hendrik brought the lantern down onto the Soulstone. The holy relic's light flared brightly as it struck the cursed artifact, shattering the jagged crystal into countless shards. A surge of energy erupted from the dais, a blinding light that filled the chamber and shook the ground beneath their feet. The crypt began to collapse, the walls cracking and the ceiling crumbling as the Soulstone's power unraveled. Hendrik stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the light. "Run!" Lucas shouted, grabbing Hendrik's arm. The two sprinted toward the entrance as the chamber crumbled around them. The pair barely escaped as the crypt collapsed behind them, the ground shaking violently as the castle's foundations gave way. They emerged into the open air, the dark clouds above parting as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. Castle Orlok groaned and shuddered, its spires collapsing in on themselves as the entire structure crumbled into ruin. The once imposing fortress was reduced to a smoldering heap of rubble, its dark reign finally ended. Lucas and Hendrik stood in silence, their breaths ragged as they watched the castle fall. The weight of their victory pressed heavily on them, tempered by the loss of Albrecht and the sacrifices made along the way. "He's gone," Hendrik said softly, his voice filled with both relief and sorrow. "Nyklas is gone." "And the Soulstone with him," Lucas replied. He turned to Hendrik, his expression grim but resolute. "It's over." As the sun rose higher, its light bathed the ruins of Castle Orlok in a golden glow. For the first time in decades, the shadow over Sylvania began to lift. The land remained scarred, but the darkness that had gripped it was finally broken. Hendrik looked to the horizon, the weight of their journey settling on him. "Albrecht believed in something greater," he said quietly. "I didn't understand it before, but now I think I do." Lucas placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder. "He gave us the chance to finish this. That's what matters." The two stood together, the ruins of Castle Orlok behind them and the promise of a brighter future ahead. The Count had fallen, and with him, the nightmare that had plagued Sylvania for so long. Chapter 27. The Aftermath. The morning sun climbed higher into the sky, its warm light cutting through the mist that clung to the ruins of Castle Orlok. The once imposing stronghold, a bastion of darkness and terror, was now nothing more than a heap of shattered stone and ash. The oppressive aura that had permeated the land for decades was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Hendrik Falk and Lucas Dietrich stood at the edge of the rubble, their faces pale with exhaustion. Around them, the remaining villagers from Wolfsbach and Dunkelwald emerged cautiously from the surrounding forest. Their wary expressions gave way to cautious relief as they saw the ruins, the absence of Nyklas's looming presence finally settling in. "It's over," Hendrik said quietly, his voice heavy with fatigue. "The Count is gone." Lucas wiped the blood from his brow, his movements slow and deliberate. "For now," he said, "but this land, it never truly forgets." As the Soulstone's destruction rippled through the land, Nyklas's undead forces began to collapse. Skeletons and zombies, once driven by his dark will, fell where they stood, their lifeless forms dissolving into ash. The abominations he had crafted from flesh and bone crumbled, their unholy forms finally succumbing to death. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the remnants of the undead army disintegrated. Some wept openly, their tears a mixture of relief and sorrow for those they had lost. Others knelt in prayer, their voices trembling as they thanked Sigmar for their deliverance. Hendrik turned to Lucas, his expression grim. "Do you think this will be enough? Without Nyklas, will they be safe?" Lucas's eyes hardened. "Nyklas may be gone, but Sylvania is far from safe. This land is steeped in darkness. It attracts things, worse things. They'll need to be vigilant." The villagers began the slow process of rebuilding. In Wolfsbach, the surviving men and women worked to repair their homes and tend to the wounded. The small chapel, though still in disrepair, became a gathering place for prayers and planning. The lantern of sanctity, now dimmed but still intact, was placed on the altar as a reminder of the victory. Hendrik walked among the villagers, his journal in hand. He spoke with those who had survived, recording their stories and their grief. The weight of their losses pressed on him as he listened to tales of families torn apart, homes destroyed, and lives forever changed. One elderly woman approached him, her hands clasped tightly around a worn locket. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You brought light back to this place." Hendrik nodded, though her gratitude felt hollow. "We did what we could," he said, "but the cost." He trailed off, his thoughts turning to Father Albrecht, whose sacrifice had made their victory possible. The priest's voice still echoed in his mind, a reminder of the unwavering faith that had carried them through the darkest moments. That evening, Hendrik sat alone on a hill overlooking the ruins of Castle Orlok. The journal lay open on his lap, its pages filled with notes and sketches of their journey. The lantern sat beside him, its light faint but steady. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Hendrik's thoughts turned inward. He had come to Sylvania as a scholar, a skeptic sent by the Church of Sigmar to observe and document. Now he was a survivor, a witness to horrors he could barely comprehend. "I never truly believed," he murmured, his voice carried away by the wind. "Not in Sigmar, not in any of it. But Albrecht, he believed enough for all of us." The memories of the battle played in his mind, vivid and haunting. The grotesque experiments in Nyklas's crypt, the thunderous collapse of the Soulstone, Albrecht's final prayer, all of it felt both distant and immediate, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Lucas approached quietly, his boots crunching on the grass. He sat beside Hendrik, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're still here," Lucas said. "It wasn't a question." "Couldn't bring myself to leave," Hendrik replied. "Not yet." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet of the night was broken only by the faint sounds of the villagers rebuilding in the distance. "Sylvania won't change overnight," Lucas said eventually. "This land is cursed. It always has been. But what we did here, it matters." Hendrik closed his journal, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "Albrecht believed we were part of something greater," he said. "I don't know if I agree, but I do know this: if we hadn't acted, no one else would have." "That's what faith is," Lucas said. "It's not about certainty. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you don't have all the answers." Hendrik nodded, though his doubts remained. He looked down at the lantern, its faint glow a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. "Do you think it's enough?" Lucas rose, his expression unreadable. "It has to be." As Hendrik watched Lucas walk back toward the village, he turned his gaze once more to the ruins of Castle Orlok. The jagged stones jutted out of the earth like broken teeth, a stark reminder of the horrors they had faced. But the darkness that had once surrounded it was gone, replaced by a fragile, fleeting sense of peace. Hendrik sighed and picked up the lantern, its weight a reminder of the burdens they had carried. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would remain. Sylvania was still a land of shadows, but for the first time in decades, there was a glimmer of light. And for Hendrik, that was enough. Chapter 28. A Lingering Threat. The days following the destruction of Castle Orlok were filled with cautious optimism. The villagers began to rebuild their lives, emboldened by the absence of the oppressive darkness that had plagued the land for so long. But for Hendrik Falk, peace proved elusive. The faint whispers started the morning after the Soulstone was destroyed. At first, he thought they were echoes of the battle, memories burned into his mind. But as the days passed, the whispers grew more distinct, low and insidious, like voices carried on the wind. No one else seemed to hear them. Hendrik's nights became restless, his dreams plagued by images of crimson light and the jagged shards of the Soulstone. On the third day, Hendrik stood near the ruins of Castle Orlok, his journal clutched tightly in his hands. The rubble had cooled, the blackened stones now overrun with moss and weeds. He walked carefully through the remnants of the outer walls, his steps hesitant as he approached what had once been the Soulstone's chamber. "Why are you here again?" Lucas Dietrich asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Hendrik turned to see the witch hunter standing a few paces away, his arms crossed. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his sharp eyes gleamed with suspicion. I don't know," Hendrik admitted. He gestured toward the ruins. "I keep hearing something. I thought maybe." Don't finish that thought," Lucas said sharply. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the rubble. "The Soulstone is gone. Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." Hendrik frowned. "And what if it is? Albrecht's sacrifice destroyed the Soulstone, but we never understood the full extent of its power. What if some part of it remains?" Lucas's expression darkened. "If it does, then we deal with it. But don't go chasing shadows. That's how people get killed in places like this." Hendrik returned to the village that evening, but the whispers followed him. They were faint, but insistent, like a distant song he couldn't ignore. As he sat by the fire in the Howling Hound, he flipped through his journal, his fingers tracing the notes and sketches he had made of the Soulstone. The whispers seemed to grow louder the longer he studied the pages. He closed the journal abruptly, his heart pounding. "It's just your imagination," he muttered to himself, though the words rang hollow. He glanced around the room, hoping for some distraction. The villagers were gathered in small groups, their voices low as they shared stories of survival and loss. Lucas sat in the corner, cleaning his pistol, his expression unreadable. Hendrik hesitated before approaching him. "Do you think it's possible for remnants of the Soulstone to linger?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Lucas didn't look up. "Possible? Yes? Likely? No. Albrecht's sacrifice sanctified the crypt. The Soulstone's influence should be gone." "But what if it isn't?" Hendrik pressed. "What if something was left behind?" Lucas finally looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "Are you hearing something?" Hendrik hesitated, then nodded. Whispers. Faint, but constant. They started after the battle. Lucas's expression hardened. "If you're right, and some part of the Soulstone remains, then we need to find it before it takes root. Sylvania doesn't need another Nyklas." That night, Hendrik couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder and his dreams were vivid and unsettling. He found himself wandering through the catacombs, the jagged shards of the Soulstone glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers called his name, their voices seductive and cruel. He woke with a start, his breath ragged. The faint glow of the lantern on the bedside table provided little comfort. He rose and stepped outside, the chill night air biting against his skin. The village was quiet, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. As he walked the perimeter, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the forest. A faint flicker of crimson light. He froze, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The light vanished, and the forest returned to silence. Hendrik returned to his room, but the unease lingered. He knew he wasn't imagining things. The Soulstone's power wasn't gone entirely. Some remnant of it persisted, waiting, watching. A dark realization. The next morning, Hendrik shared his experience with Lucas. The witch hunter listened carefully, his jaw tightening as Hendrik described the flicker of crimson light. "If you're right," Lucas said, "then the Soulstone wasn't completely destroyed. A fragment may still exist." "But how?" Hendrik asked. "Albrecht's sacrifice should have destroyed it entirely." Lucas shrugged. "Relics of that kind don't obey natural laws. If even a sliver of the Soulstone survived, it could still corrupt this land." Hendrik ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "So what do we do? Search the ruins again? Scour the forest? We barely survived the first time." "We watch," Lucas said simply. "We wait. And if we see signs of its influence, we act. Until then, we can't risk chasing something that might not exist." Hendrik nodded reluctantly, though his unease didn't fade. The whispers still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness they had fought to destroy. As he returned to his work documenting the events of the past weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that their victory had come at a cost they had yet to fully understand. As the days turned into weeks, the villagers of Wolfsbach continued their slow recovery. But for Hendrik, the whispers never faded. They became a quiet companion, a reminder that the darkness in Sylvania was never truly gone. Standing once more at the edge of the ruined castle, Hendrik closed his eyes and listened. The faint whispers of the Soulstone called to him, tempting him, warning him. And in his heart he knew Sylvania's shadows had not been vanquished. They had only been tempered. Chapter 29. A Life of Vigilance. The morning sun cast long shadows over the scarred remnants of Wolfsbach, its golden rays breaking through the ever-present mists of Sylvania. Hendrik Falk stood at the edge of the village, staring out toward the distant ruins of Castle Orlach. The once menacing silhouette of the vampire's fortress was now reduced to jagged rubble, a reminder of their hard-won victory and the lingering threat that still haunted the land. Hendrik's journal lay open in his hands, its pages filled with sketches, notes, and accounts of the horrors he had witnessed. Every line was etched with the weight of his experiences, a chronicle of their battle against Nyklas von Carstein and the darkness he had wielded. "This can't be the end," Hendrik murmured to himself, his voice barely audible above the faint rustling of the wind. Returning to the village, Hendrik made his way to the makeshift chapel, where the Lantern of Sanctity now rested. It was dimmer than it had been during their journey, its holy light subdued but still present. Hendrik knelt before the altar, his journal set carefully beside him. "I came here as a scholar," he said quietly, speaking to the empty room. "I thought this was just another investigation, another chance to prove that superstition and fear were the real enemies of the Empire." He paused, his gaze fixed on the lantern. "But I was wrong. I've seen the truth. The darkness is real, and it's everywhere. It doesn't stop, and it doesn't sleep." Hendrik closed his eyes, the faces of those they had lost flashing through his mind. Father Albrecht, who had given his life to sanctify the crypt, the villagers who had fought and died to protect their homes, even Lucas Dietrich, whose unyielding determination had been both a strength and a burden. "I can't undo what's been done," Hendrik continued, his voice firming with resolve. "But I can make sure it's not forgotten. I can make sure others know what's out there and how to fight it." Later that day, Hendrik found Lucas near the edge of the forest, inspecting the remnants of a shattered undead guardian. The witch hunter was meticulous, his sharp eyes scanning the ground for any signs of lingering corruption. "You're leaving?" Lucas said without looking up. Hendrik hesitated, then nodded. "Soon. There's nothing more I can do here." Lucas straightened, brushing dirt from his gloves. "And what will you do? Return to Altdorf? Write a book about all this?" "Maybe," Hendrik replied, "but not just for the scholars in their ivory towers. People need to know the truth about what's out here. They need to know how to fight it." Lucas smirked faintly, though there was no humor in his expression. "Knowledge won't save them, Falk. Steel and faith will." "They'll need both," Hendrik said. "But knowledge is where it starts. If they don't understand what they're facing, they'll never survive." Lucas regarded him for a moment, then nodded. You're not wrong. Just remember what you've seen here is only the beginning. The old world is full of monsters, Falk, and not all of them are as obvious as Nyklas. Hendrik managed a faint smile. I'll keep that in mind. That evening, Hendrik gathered his belongings in the small room he had been using at the Howling Hound. His satchel was heavier than when he had arrived in Sylvania, now filled with pages of notes, maps, and sketches. He paused as he packed the last of his journals, his fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. The whispers that had haunted him in the days after the battle were still faintly present, like the echo of a distant storm. But now they served as a reminder, a call to vigilance rather than fear. He strapped the satchel to his back and slung his coat over his shoulders. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him, and he took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. Before leaving the village, Hendrik stopped at the chapel one last time. The villagers had placed flowers and candles around the lantern, their offerings a testament to the hope it had brought them. Kneeling before the altar, Hendrik whispered a silent prayer. It wasn't for Sigmar, or for forgiveness, or even for guidance. It was a promise, a vow to remember what had been sacrificed to bring light to the darkness. "Thank you, Albrecht," he said softly, rising to his feet. As he turned to leave, he found Lucas waiting by the chapel door. The witch hunter gave him a curt nod. "Safe travels, Falk. And don't forget, Sylvania isn't the only place where darkness festers." Hendrik nodded in return. "I won't." With that, he set off down the road, the faint glow of the lantern visible through the chapel windows behind him. As Hendrik walked, his mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The Empire was vast, and its people were plagued by countless horrors, vampires, necromancers, beasts of chaos. He had seen only a fraction of what the old world had to offer, but it was enough to know that his work was far from over. He resolved to document every step of his journey, every shadow he encountered, and every victory, no matter how small. The knowledge he gathered would be his weapon, a light to guide those who came after him. "The darkness doesn't end," he muttered to himself, "but neither does the fight." With the ruins of Castle Orlok behind him and the open road ahead, Hendrik Falk began a new chapter in his life, not as a mere scholar, but as a witness to the horrors of the old world and a beacon for those willing to stand against them.